Hey everyone, tonight we travel far from the battlefields and royal banquets, away from the flickering fires of knights' tales and the echoing chants of monks. Instead, we enter a quieter world, quieter, yet no less vital. In an age of swords and songs, they were ledgers, crisp parchment, damp with the scent of iron ink, quills scratching numbers not for glory, but for balance. A world where empires turned, not just on the swing of a blade, but on the turn of a column. Tonight's journey leads us into the dim back rooms of castles, the flickering candle-lit alcoves behind market stalls, and the corners of monasteries not dedicated to prayer, but to accounting. The medieval accountants, they were never in the paintings. No one sang ballads in their name, and yet, if the numbers didn't add up, neither did their heads. That's not just a saying. In many cases, it was a very real occupational hazard. Imagine a man hunched over a table for 16 hours, tracing the flow of barley shipments, sheep counts, or salt taxes. His world wasn't made of gold and glory, but of weighty ledgers and whispered frustrations. He wore no armor, but often bore the brunt of royal miscalculations. He made no laws, but enforced them by columns and coin. If the kingdom ran smoothly, he was forgotten. If it did not, he was blamed. The world of medieval accounting was a world of tension. Every unit of grain, every yard of cloth, every unpaid fee echoed through these dusty records. Mistakes could mean shortages, rebellions, or even war. And yet, beneath this enormous pressure, many accountants created systems, not just of numbers, but of order, of meaning, and, oddly enough, of poetry. Yes, poetry, because when you're tracking tax on chimney smoke and trying to explain an absent pig, sometimes rhymes make more sense than logic. The accountants of the Middle Ages weren't just being counters. They were interpreters of chaos, translators between royal will and peasant labor. Some were corrupt, others were visionaries. Most were exhausted. This episode is not about knights or kings. It's about those who sat behind them, quiet, unsung, and indispensable. Over the next 2 hours, we'll visit the great academy of arithmetic, where no one laughed unless someone subtracted. We'll meet legendary figures like Sir Baldric the Tallied, whose counting error became lore. We'll examine taxes so absurd they read like satire, poems that doubled as budgets, and cats that protected ledgers from disaster. So close your eyes, settle into the soft cadence of parchment and pen, and let us begin a story where the heroes were robes instead of armor, where the battleground is the balance sheet, and where history hums not with trumpets but with the soft, steady rhythm of a quill upon vellum. Imagine a narrow courtyard enclosed by high stone walls, its silence broken only by the occasional flutter of parchment and the rhythmic scratching of quills. This was not a monastery, though it bore the hush of sacred spaces. Nor was it a battlefield, though within its walls many fought epic duels with numbers, with logic, and sometimes with despair. It was the Academy of Arithmetic, a peculiar yet formidable institution nestled between the wool markets and the city records office of a town long swallowed by time. There, beneath the solemn arches and shadowed eaves, young men trained in the ancient and perilous art of medieval bookkeeping. The entrance to the academy bore no grand carvings, no triumphant heraldry, just a single slab of weathered limestone etched with Latin too faded to read and a small brass plaque that reads simply, "Entries must be accurate." Inside, one found no laughter, or rather, none that lasted longer than the flicker of a mistake. It was said among the students that laughter only erupted when someone subtracted instead of adding, and even then, the sound was short-lived. For in this place, numbers were sacred, errors were sins, and each student bore the silent burden of future empires balanced on the blade-thin edge of ink. The students arrived young. Many barely passed the age of apprenticeship. They came from merchant families, low-ranking nobles, or occasionally, from monasteries eager to train someone who could count tithes better than prayers. They wore modest robes and dyed wool that itched in summer and soaked in rain. Around their necks hung wax tablets, used for impromptu calculations or notes taken when ink was too dear. Their hands were stained with the peculiar gray of lead dust, soot, and quill smears, marks that even holy water could not scrub away. Each morning began the same. A bell rang never joyfully, but always on time. The students filed into the lecture hall, a long echoing room with sloping floors and no cushions on the benches. At the front stood Master Elric of Numbers, a man whose face never smiled and whose voice never cracked. He spoke in careful tones, each phrase measured like a line of calculation. His beard was streaked with ash and chalk from years of leaning too close to the board. He had once been the king's own tallyman, but after a mysterious incident involving a missing census and a duplicate cow, he was reassigned to teach. No one dared ask about the cow. The curriculum was rigorous, though few outsiders would have understood its severity. Students studied the art of emergency addition, the rapid computation required when inventory was short and nights were impatient. They practiced defensive subtraction, a technique useful for obscuring minor deficits without outright fraud. One infamous course titled Disputation in the absence of receipts trained students to argue logically in situations where documentation had mysteriously vanished. Entire days were devoted to verifying tally sticks, pieces of wood notched with records of debt and payment, still in use even as parchment became more common. The act of notching had to be precise. A single slip of the knife could mean a missing pig or an extra oxen, neither of which was easy to explain to a baron. Books were few. Instead, knowledge lived in scrolls, in chants, and in call and response memorization sessions where students recited tax ledgers aloud until the numbers became music. They were scrolls of the king's harvest, inventories from long-forgotten grain houses, and lists of tithes paid by distant abbeys with suspicious regularity. The scrolls were often copied by hand, each student assigned one parchment at a time. Mistakes were corrected with vinegar and a sharp stone, leaving behind a soft blur on the surface, each blur a ghost of an almost catastrophe. Despite the strictness, there was beauty in the repetition. The act of balancing accounts became meditative, a kind of quiet harmony between thought and ink. There were moments, rare but luminous, when a student would complete a full ledger without error. These moments were marked with the ringing of a small silver bell, and the student's name would be inscribed in a hidden book kept behind the master's lectern. It was said that those whose names appeared there would never suffer mathematical embarrassment again, even in the afterlife. Outside the classroom, life was no less strict. Meals were taken in silence, accompanied by readings of historic budget statements from prior centuries. Students who ate too quickly were reminded that haste is the enemy of accuracy. They practiced ink preparation each week, grinding soot and iron salts with vinegar and water to create their own supply. The ink had to be consistent, too runny, and it bled across the page. Too thick, and it cracked like dried blood. The process itself became a test of patience, a ritual reminding each student that precision started long before the numbers were written. The dormitories were shared, beds were narrow and stiff, sheets were burlap, and light was forbidden after sunset. Those caught reading ledgers by candlelight, tempting though it was, were required to copy the entire book of local tax adjustments by hand, a punishment feared more than even dismissal. Yet, despite the austerity, there was camaraderie. They whispered stories of great auditors, past of Beatrix the Bold, who recalculated a duchy's treasury by smell alone, or Alwyn the Gentle, who once reconciled conflicting ledgers from a battlefield tent as arrows flew overhead. These legends gave them hope that one day they too might earn a quiet mention in some dusty footnote of history. No part of their education prepared them for glory. It prepared them instead for endurance, to watch, to wait, to calculate, to nod politely as others took credit for peace or prosperity, knowing that somewhere beneath it all, a formula balanced by their own ink kept the chaos at bay. When they graduated, and many did not, they were assigned posts across the realm. Some served barons, others monasteries, and a few fortunate souls were summoned to royal courts, where the ledgers were thick and the nerves were thinner still. But each one left the Academy of Arithmetic with a quiet pride. They had trained in silence, resisted error, and mastered the invisible threads that held kingdoms together. And perhaps most important of all, they had learned when to smile only when someone else miscounted, and never for long. And now, as we close the tall oak doors of this solemn academy, we turn our attention to a tale that lived beyond its walls. A student who rose to notoriety not by mastering his craft, but by misunderstanding it entirely. Join me as we step into the story of Sir Baldric the Tallied, a man whose fingers moved faster than his thoughts and whose miscount became the stuff of eternal academic caution. In the long quiet halls of forgotten memory, there are names that flicker like candle light, faint but persistent. One such name belongs not to a conqueror nor a saint, but to a man once considered the most promising student in the Academy of Arithmetic. His name was Baldric of Dunsmuir, later known affectionately, resignedly, and irreversibly as Sir Baldric the Tallied. His tale begins not with triumph, but with a simple counting board and a moment of confusion that would ripple across ledgers for decades to come. Baldric was not born into numbers. He came from a modest family of coopers, his days in childhood filled more with sawdust and barrel rings than ink and tally sticks. But he had a rare gift. From an early age, he could count chickens in motion, predict rainfall by patterns of moss, and once calculated the number of bricks in a wall simply by hearing his father describe it. It was this strange aptitude that caught the attention of a traveling scribe who, in exchange for a small keg of cider, agreed to bring Baldric's name to the Academy. When he arrived, the boy was curious and quick and utterly undisciplined. He cared little for posture or parchment margins. His robes were always crooked, his wax tablets smeared, and he had an unfortunate tendency to hum during examination sessions. But he grasped the heart of arithmetic in a way few others did. Numbers moved through him like wind through a chime, natural, melodic, and slightly unpredictable. His instructors watched him with a blend of admiration and dread. It was said he solved a 6-page inheritance ledger in his second month, but also accidentally double-counted an entire herd of goats on the same day. The goats, to this day, are disputed in legal records. The true legend of Baldric began when he was introduced to the abacus, a recent acquisition from a merchant caravan that passed through the town. The counting device was rectangular and strange, its beads sliding along thin rods with a soft clatter that seemed to lull students into either focus or fear. Master Elric presented it during a morning lecture, describing its origin and potential, warning it was not for the untrained. Baldric, of course, was enchanted. He requested to borrow it for personal study, a request granted with cautious reluctance and a firm reminder to record all findings. He did record them. Unfortunately, he did so while holding the abacus upside down. At first, no one noticed. Baldric's calculations remained quick and, strangely, consistent. But over the following weeks, discrepancies began to appear. Not dramatic, but persistent. Wool shipments were overpaid. Bread taxes collected in strange increments. A castle somewhere received 3 extra chandeliers. The royal accountant was alerted. An investigation began. And Baldric, unaware, continued to use his inverted abacus with cheerful determination, oblivious to the growing chaos in the realm's economic veins. When the mistake was finally uncovered, it was not by a senior auditor, but by a janitor who had studied in his youth and recognized the unusual bead arrangement. The janitor quietly brought the matter to the Academy. The inquiry that followed was grave. Baldric was summoned. He stood in the echoing hall of review, holding the abacus gently, still confused. When asked why he had reversed the order of operations, he replied, simply, "It made more sense that way." The room fell into a stunned silence. Master Elric closed his eyes. The head of the council sighed. The investigation records show no anger, only a deep and collective bewilderment. Surprisingly, Baldric was not expelled. Instead, he was given a new title, the Tallied, not as an honor, but as a reminder. His ledgers were bound in red twine and placed in the Academy's Hall of Learning Errors, a chamber rarely discussed and never toured. The abacus was placed beside them, under a sheet of linen, not destroyed but never used again. Students were brought there once a year to read his pages, to see how order could become disorder through a simple tilt of perspective. His name became a lesson, a warning, and, oddly enough, an inspiration. For Baldric did not fade into disgrace. His story spread, and with it, his peculiar genius. Several regions adopted his reversed abacus style, claiming it aligned better with their local coinage system. A few scholars even defended his reasoning, writing treatises with titles like The Symmetrical Ledger and On Counting as Perception. Baldric himself left the academy and wandered, never fully employed, but often consulted. He was seen in taverns scribbling diagrams with flour on tables, muttering about the spiritual nature of addition. He was occasionally brought to courtrooms to testify on obscure financial discrepancies. He rarely made sense, but when he did, it was profound. He wore no title of nobility, but children whispered that he had once advised a prince. He owned no estate, but one village erected a statue of him in their market square, a simple figure, robed, holding an abacus gently in both hands. Beneath it, an inscription. He tried, and, in some strange way, he succeeded. His miscount had revealed not just the fragility of accounting systems, but the odd elasticity of trust. In a world that demanded precision, his error became a symbol of humble fallibility, a reminder that even in the most exacting fields, the human hand still trembles, and the mind, in its creativity, sometimes leans sideways. In his final years, Baldric lived near the sea. He recorded tides and wave patterns, attempting to devise a system where debts could be forgiven based on the lunar cycle. It never caught on. But a few of his scrolls survive, water-stained and filled with poetic footnotes that make little sense yet carry a kind of sleepy beauty. One such note reads, "If gold forgets itself in the dark, may we not forgive the copper?" No one knows where he was buried. Some say he faded quietly in a cottage surrounded by cats. Others claim he set sail with merchants and never returned. But his legend remained a tale of a man who saw numbers not just as tools, but as companions in an ongoing dance of meaning and misunderstanding. And now, with the story of Baldric drifting into our minds like the murmur of distant ink on parchment, we turn to another facet of this curious history. One not of men, but of the burdens they carried. The world of taxation in the Middle Ages was as bewildering as it was burdensome, and it was the accountants who had to make sense of it. Let us now enter a realm of salt taxes, wine levies, and perhaps the most mysterious fee of all, a tax simply labeled because we need the money. To truly understand the daily life of a medieval accountant, one must first step into the tangled, often surreal world of taxation. It was not merely a matter of coin exchanged for land or labor. No, in those times, taxes flowed as unpredictably as rivers in spring, shifting with the whims of kings, the needs of war, or simply the appetite of an ambitious local lord. There were taxes that made sense, if only barely. And then there were taxes that seemed born not from economics, but from poetry, mischief, or madness. It fell upon the accountants to decipher these edicts, to track them, and most of all, to explain them when no explanation seemed possible. Among the oldest and most bewildering of these levies was the salt tax. Salt, more than a seasoning, was a preservative and a preservational obsession. It held food steady through winter, kept meat from spoiling on long journeys, and was so valued that it was occasionally referred to as white gold. And so, naturally, it was taxed, but the tax was not fixed. It fluctuated based on proximity to salt mines, rainfall, and, in one peculiar instance, the appearance of a double rainbow during the solstice. Records show one village charged a higher rate on days when the salt appeared to shimmer. This was explained, in the margin of a surviving ledger, as evidence of divine refinement. Next came the wind levy. At first, it was levied only on windmills, those curious structures that spun and groaned on the edge of cultivated fields. Their presence was new, strange, and undoubtedly profitable. But, as with many taxes, its reach began to spread. Soon, landowners were charged not for owning windmills, but for existing in regions where wind was considered unusually profitable. Maps were drawn with ink and speculation, showing where wind blew with productive intent versus where it was lazy or indifferent. Entire provinces petitioned to be declared breeze neutral, citing lack of meaningful gusts. One town, according to its records, attempted to measure wind with suspended goose feathers. Their accountant noted in a side comment that the feathers kept flying away. But perhaps the most infamous of all was the fee labeled in official documents as "because we need the money." It appeared suddenly in the early 1300s, without fanfare or decree. Just a line item, small at first, then bolder, repeated across regions. When questioned, the response was almost always the same: a shrug, a vague gesture toward distant wars, or a muttering about roads and bridges. It was a tax untethered from justification, and, as such, it became oddly permanent. Accountants were left to explain it creatively. Some wrote elaborate stories about mythical beasts that needed funding for containment. Others claimed it was a tithe for cosmic balance. A few simply recorded it as atmospheric maintenance. One particularly exhausted ledger entry reads, quite plainly, "For reasons beyond our remit." Of course, with taxes came receipts, and with receipts came disputes. Peasants often paid in kind barrels of grain, woven cloth, chickens of ambiguous value. How do you calculate the worth of an especially aggressive goose? Or a wheel of cheese whose smell had driven away the horses? Accountants had to become part philosopher, part diplomat. A particularly poetic scribe once noted in a winter tax journal, "One man's stench is another man's treasure." Another wrote, "Paid in onions, we accepted, but we do not forgive." Even were the seasonal taxes. In some northern regions, a fee called the winter sadness charge was collected annually, justified by the increased use of firewood and the cost of spiritual fatigue. Each household paid 2 coins, one for warmth and one for sorrow. In particularly cold years, a 3rd coin was added for unspoken despair. Elsewhere, a festival of frogs required a temporary levy on pond access, though records suggest no frogs ever attended. And in one forgotten valley, residents paid a noise tax if their sheep bleated too loudly after dusk. These peculiarities, though strange, served a purpose. They kept the population engaged, reminded them of their place within the sprawling tapestry of monarchy and church, and perhaps most importantly ensured that scribes remained perpetually employed. The more complicated the taxes became, the more vital the accountants were. With every coin logged and anomaly recorded, they became guardians not only of wealth, but of explanation. Without them, the kingdom would be reduced to barter and confusion. With them, it maintained a fragile coherence. But not all accepted these taxes quietly. Revolts have been started over less. In 1293, a bakers' guild in the southern provinces refused to pay the annual crust thickness tariff, arguing that the variance in their loaves was artistic, not economic. Their refusal led to a week-long protest in which nothing was baked but air-filled dough sculptures. The government responded by taxing those as well. The final tally was marked with a weary note in the archives: "Bread remains political." Then came the task of auditing. No longer just recorders, accountants had to verify not only that taxes were paid, but that they were properly imagined. Consider the case of the mill shadow dispute, where 2 villages fought over whether a single windmill's shadow counted as taxable square footage. The accountant assigned spent 3 months tracking the shadow's movement with a bucket of chalk and a very patient dog. He eventually concluded that the shadow was too inconsistent to charge, but the dog had to be paid in sausages for its time. There were darker moments, of course. Tax collectors were often unpopular. Houses were shuttered at their approach, dogs trained to bark at the sight of ledgers. Some accountants disguised themselves as mendicant monks to travel safely. Others worked only by letter. sending instructions and receiving parcels of wool and resentment by courier. In rare cases, they vanished. Their names were struck from the rolls, but occasionally resurfaced in footnotes, marked simply as lost to the numbers. And yet through all of it, through absurd fees and contested geese, the system held. Not because it was fair, but because it was deeply documented. And the documents lived. Scrolls of tax rules were copied, debated, amended. Some became so elaborate that a single page required its own index. These documents were often stored in archives that were guarded not by soldiers, but by cats, their presence noted in the margins of ledgers. The cats, it turns out, were more reliable than locks. As we step back from this baffling web of fees, fines, and imaginary obligations, one thing becomes clear. The true genius of medieval accounting lay not in balancing coins, but in balancing belief. They made people believe that what they paid mattered, that the system had rhyme even if it lacked reason. And in doing so, they kept the realm from slipping into chaos. Now, as we close this chapter of taxes with names stranger than fiction, let us enter the world where these accountants labored. Behind all the numbers, there was a place, a room, a desk, a candle burned down to its base. Let us walk now into the spaces where work was done, the ink was mixed with sweat, and the parchment turned yellow under the weight of days. Let us visit the world of 18-hour shifts and forgotten lunch, of dust-filled air and mumbled calculations. A world lit not by glory, but by the dull, steady glow of need. If one were to step into the workspace of a medieval accountant, expecting tidy desks and orderly stacks of paper, they would quickly be disoriented. These were not clean offices humming with the sound of quills on pristine scrolls. They were low-lit corners of keeps, damp cellar alcoves behind chapels, rooms built not for comfort, but for containment. And within these small chambers, amid the constant presence of dust and the quiet hum of calculations, men labored for hours on end, hours that stretched longer than most would believe possible, broken only by the occasional collapse of body or candle. The spaces were rarely large. Often, a single room served as both archive and office, with shelves that sagged under the weight of vellum rolls and tally sticks. The air was thick with the musty scent of old parchment and the faint bitterness of ink made from soot and vinegar. It clung to the skin, the lungs, and the mind. It was not unusual to enter these spaces in the morning light and emerge after sunset unsure if it had been minutes or days. The rhythm of time dissolved in the counting, and the candle's slow descent became a more reliable clock than any church bell. Candles themselves were both a ally and enemy. Their dim glow enabled the work, but strained the eyes until numbers shimmered into shapes and ledgers blurred into poems. Wax dripped onto the edges of scrolls, hardening into strange forms that some considered omens. One accountant, in a particularly cold winter, recorded that the melted wax had taken the shape of a howling beast. He then made a mistake in recording livestock numbers and blamed the wax entirely. His supervisor added a comment in the margin: the beast was persuasive. The ink was mixed in-house, usually once a week. It was composed of soot gathered from cooking fires, combined with iron salts, rainwater, and sometimes the tears of frustration, though that last ingredient was never officially recorded. The ink could not be too thin, or it would vanish into the fibers of the parchment. Too thick, and it cracked with age, flaking off like black snow. The ideal mix was a matter of art, not science, and required a sensitivity that bordered on the monastic. Each accountant guarded their recipe with quiet pride, convinced that the stability of the kingdom rested on the hue of their particular blend. Their quills were trimmed daily. Goose feathers were most common, though raven was preferred by the ambitious for its darker flair. A properly sharpened quill sang as it wrote, a soft whispering stroke that traced across the page like a breath through reeds. But a dull quill was treacherous. It would splatter, catch the fibers of the vellum, or produce lines so faint they faded by season's end. And there was no forgiveness in fading. The phrase "faint ink invites strong correction" was repeated so often it became a kind of blessing whispered over fresh pages. The desks were often reused furniture. borrowed from churches, or repurposed from banquet halls. Rarely level, frequently splintered, they tilted slightly so ink would run in one direction if spilled. A small groove was sometimes carved to rest a candle or catch stray wax. The parchment, heavier than modern paper, came from animal skins, primarily sheep or goats. Smooth in places and coarse in others, each sheet bore its own mood. Some were agreeable, accepting ink with grace. Others resisted, their surface too oily or too dry, and had to be scraped clean with a curved blade called a lunellum. The scraping left scars, silent echoes of the corrections made beneath. Meals were not scheduled, they happened between columns, during moments of clarity or collapse. Bread was kept in corners, cheese wrapped in cloth, apples hidden in drawers lined with hay. The food was dry, the water stale, and the mood mostly resigned. Conversations were rare. A cough might echo for minutes before being answered. Sneezes were met with wary glances, especially if the ledgers were open. More than one accountant had to rewrite an entire page because a sudden sneeze had startled a quill into mischief. 18-hour shifts were not a boast but a necessity. The backlog was eternal. Kingdoms produced chaos faster than it could be catalogued. War demanded tallies of swords and grain. Peace demanded taxes and renovations. Weddings meant gifts to record. Funerals meant estates to divide. Every event, from the birth of a noble child to the loss of a cow, found its way into the ledger, and someone had to record it. When exhaustion arrived, and it always did, it came not like a storm, but like sand in the joints. Perhaps a hand trembled slightly, perhaps a name was written backward. Perhaps the numbers refused to align no matter how many times they were rechecked. Eventually, the body gave in. Sleep came where it must, at the desk, on the floor, against a shelf. Some accountants developed the art of sleeping with their heads still upright, their hands resting lightly on their quills. A moment of rest, then the work resumed. The documents were stored in rolls, tied with ribbons of faded color to denote importance. Red for royal, blue for ecclesiastical, green for market, and brown for what could not be classified. Over time, the colors faded into similarity, and only the smell of the ink or the pressure of the scribe's hand could identify them. To an outsider, it was a mess. To the accountant, it was a map of memory. They knew the lean of a ledger's handwriting, the scratchy haste of a wartime report, the careful curves of a noble's estate registry. Each page was a voice they understood. Silence was the unspoken rule, not imposed, but chosen. It was easier to hear the numbers that way, easier to track their shifting patterns, to follow the rhythm of the work. Even when two accountants worked side by side, they rarely spoke. A nod might be exchanged, or a murmured curse when ink spilled, but otherwise, they existed in a kind of companionable quiet. Alone together, bonded by calculation. In the winter months, the cold was unrelenting. Fingers stiffened, ink thickened, and breath clouded before faces. Gloves could not be worn. The quills required too much precision, so hands were wrapped in strips of wool with the fingertips bare. Pages curled from damp, and candles burned faster as the days grew darker. The work continued, always. The kingdom did not sleep simply because the cold arrived. And so the accountant worked, through hunger, through boredom, through the aching certainty that no one would ever know the effort behind each entry. That behind every coin counted, every name logged, every cow recorded, there was a person hunched over parchment, squinting through smoke and fatigue, drawing order from disorder. Their reward was not recognition, but the quiet certainty that they had done their duty. That the numbers, at least for that day, were whole. Now, as we lift ourselves from this dust-filled chamber, let us turn to a moment when one number failed to be whole. When a simple mistake, a single curve of ink set in motion a ripple of confusion so vast it led to years of investigation and the quiet death of trust in a particular numeral. Join me now as we examine what happens when 4 looks a little too much like 9. In the quiet kingdom of ledger keepers, where columns ruled more firmly than kings and parchment held more sway than proclamations, there was one fear that kept even the most meticulous accountants awake into the flickering hours of candle light. It was not war, nor plague, nor famine that haunted them, but the subtle terror of the miswritten numeral. For in a world that hinged upon accurate records where every sheep and sack of grain was balanced like stars in a fragile sky, the wrong shape of a number could unravel reason itself. And so it was that one day in a spring damp with rain, an ink as simple for curved, just slightly too far, was read as a 9, and from that humble mistake came a storm that would last not for hours, but for 8 long years. The tale began in a modest granary tucked beneath the southern hills, where barley was measured not by baskets, but by scroll. The estate was unremarkable, with no history of scandal and a long-standing record of timely taxes. Their annual submission to the royal tithe showed a line item marked with care: 40 sacks of barley harvested, dried, and stored. The scribe who penned it, Aldrich, son of no great lineage, but loyal to ink and process, wrote with a hand steady if weary. The 4 he inscribed had a loop, perhaps shaped by the last drop of ink or the last sigh of effort. When the record reached the office of grain proportions in the capital, the clerk there squinted by candlelight and saw not 40 but 90. A simple shift in ink, a single curl to round, and the numbers no longer matched the world. Had this been a realm of leniency, the mistake might have ended there. But the tax had been paid for 40 sacks, while the record now claimed 90. And in medieval administration, inconsistency was the crack from which chaos might bloom. The clerk flagged the discrepancy, and a letter was sent requesting clarification. It arrived weeks later, as letters did, by muddy hoof and reluctant courier. The estate insisted the count was accurate, that only 40 sacks existed, that no deceit had occurred. But the damage was done. A second auditor was dispatched, one trained not in trust, but in suspicion. He arrived with tools of the trade, a scale for weights, a chart for grain volume, a quill as sharp as doubt. He counted each sack himself, and found only 40 stacked in neat rows atop wood planks and mouse droppings. Still the record said 90, and law required explanation. Thus began the inquiry, not out of malice, but out of the machinery of a system built on precision. A committee was formed, first 3 scribes, then 5, then an entire subsection within the Department of Agricultural Reconciliation. The scribe Aldrich was summoned, questioned, and required to present his original draft. It showed a faint numeral 4, with an awkward curve, but still clearly, at least to him, a 4. Yet the official copy bore the 9. His supervisor claimed the copy had been made by another, and that perhaps Aldrich had corrected it post facto. The blame shifted like wine through dry leaves. The estate protested their innocence and insisted no such volume of grain had ever existed. But the tax had already been collected, the overage had already been recorded in royal summaries, and the ledgers had moved on. Still the investigators did not. Over months and then years they searched for similar anomalies. A young archivist named Marin took special interest in the case and unearthed 15 additional examples where numerals had misbehaved. One estate had delivered 100 sheep when only 10 were recorded. Another had been accused of failing to pay on 5 horses that no one had ever seen. The errors multiplied not from deception, but from human hands trembling in cold ink, thick with soot, and eyes dimmed by candle light. The solution was as predictable as it was exhausting. More rules. Every number was henceforth to be written in both Arabic and Latin form, with words spelled out in the margin. Ledgers doubled in length, but not in clarity. Aldrich, meanwhile, was reassigned to the basement of the Ministry of Pickled Goods, where he recorded the seasonal temperature fluctuations of vinegar barrels. No longer trusted with numbers, he was instead entrusted with brine. His colleagues whispered of his fate with a mix of pity and reverence. He had become a cautionary tale, not for fraud, but for curvature. Back in the capital the inquiry stretched on. New officials inherited it, each adding notes and questions and footnotes. One auditor wrote that the matter had transcended barley and now existed as a philosophical dilemma. How do we define error in a world built on imprecision? Another wrote that perhaps the true number was 49 as a cosmic compromise. The stack of scrolls dedicated to the matter reached a height taller than the average page. Still no conclusion could be found. The cows were counted, the chickens weighed, but the missing barley remained forever absent. Finally, in the 8th year, a resolution arrived, not from discovery, but from exhaustion. The office declared the incident an unfortunate but innocent mistake. The estate was cleared of wrongdoing. Aldrich's name was quietly omitted from future training manuals. A brief note was added to the Grand Register of Irregularities stating simply that numbers must be handled with reverence. No further action was taken. The parchment was folded, sealed, and placed into the archives, where it gathered dust next to the great flour discrepancy of 1279. And yet among scribes and junior accountants the tale lived on. It was told to apprentices sharpening their first quills, whispered during night shifts beside guttering candles. "Be careful," they said, "or your 4 will become a 9, and the kingdom will never recover." Some claimed that Aldrich's number still drifted through forgotten ledgers, curling and curving and confusing the future. Others said they had seen his ghost bent over an invisible page muttering quatuor under his breath. The moral, if there was one, lingered gently in the air. That even in an empire of steel and sermons, it was ink that kept the truth alive. That mistakes, however small, could ripple outward through years of bureaucracy and bind good men to shame. And yet through it all the system endured, not because it was flawless, but because it kept writing. As this story of error and endurance fades into the calm of night, let us move onward into the next peculiar tale. For there came a time when the kingdom embarked upon its most ambitious tally ever undertaken, the great royal audit of 1324, and in the process misplaced not gold nor grain, but let 7 cows that may never have existed at all. Join me as we gently turn the page toward imagined livestock and poetic confusion. In the grand and dusty archives of the Middle Ages, where scrolls pile high like forgotten hills, and ink fades to the color of tea, there lies a particular ledger dated in the year 1324 that contains a puzzle both simple and strangely enduring. The great royal audit of that year was meant to be a comprehensive reckoning of everything taxable and accountable under the crown's long shadow. What it became was a minor legend curiously retold among scholars, recited in whispers by apprentice scribes, and preserved in the margins of dusty books for generations to come. It all began with a discrepancy involving 7 cows. At the time, the kingdom faced unrest not from war or famine, but from uncertainty. Reports were unclear. Roads had been declared paved yet remained muddy. Barracks claimed full stores of weaponry no soldier had seen. Royal kitchens listed 10 pigs roasted for a single feast, where guests remembered only stew. Suspicion quietly grew within the walls of the palace, not of rebellion, but of inefficiency. And so the king, tired of contradictions, demanded clarity. Thus began the great Auditan empire-wide effort to account for every item, tool, creature, and coin. Auditors, those seldom celebrated stewards of numbers and order, were dispatched from the capital. They rode in pairs or trios, armed not with blades but ledgers, quills, and a sense of weary purpose. They spoke little, observed much, and often spent long evenings under flickering candlelight parsing out whether a reported duck had truly existed or had merely been hoped for by a hungry farmer. These auditors ventured into valleys and up toward highland villages, asking the same patient questions again and again. One such group arrived at a fog-wrapped corner of the realm known as Cernbridge. Here the land was damp and quiet, the air thick with the scent of soil and ash, and the locals slow to speak. The estate in question was modest fields of barley, a creaking barn, and 14 cows noted in the previous year's records. On the surface, this seemed straightforward. But, as the auditors read through the inventory, they noticed something odd. The first 7 cows were clearly listed with names and descriptions: Rosie, Bar Lamb, Clover Nose, and so on. The next 7 were different, no names, faint ink, and next to them, scribbled in cramped handwriting, a note read, "Possibly visible on Thursdays." This was, to put it gently, not standard ledger language. The auditors questioned the steward of the estate, a man named Tholen, whose beard was more persuasive than his memory. He nodded slowly. Yes, there were 14 cows. Always had been, or at least, almost always. He gestured toward the mist-shrouded pasture and muttered something about how some animals were more elusive than others. His assistant, a younger man with eyes like puddles and a tendency to sigh, claimed he had seen all 14 cows once, just before sunrise, standing like statues in the fog. But when he blinked, half were gone. The auditors were used to excuses. They had heard about wolves, floods, thefts, and divine interventions. But this was new. Still, they conducted their work carefully. They measured feed supplies, examined hoof prints, counted manure piles, and cross-checked local witness statements. Everything suggested 7 cows had clearly been present, the other 7 ambiguous. Their presence was felt in whispers, in missing hay, and in the occasional trampled patch of grass. Unwilling to declare anything false without full proof, the auditors marked the anomaly in their scroll. The phrase possibly visible on Thursdays was copied faithfully, followed by a short paragraph expressing uncertainty but not disbelief. This report was sent to the Capitol, where it arrived nestled between more mundane documents about lantern taxes and shepherd disputes. For a time, it was ignored, but curiosity is contagious. A young clerk in the Central Audit Office found the phrasing amusing and shared it with a colleague. Soon the story passed from desk to desk like a riddle. A subcommittee was formed not to question the cow's existence, but to decide how to classify creatures that might or might not be there. The committee, composed of skeptical auditors, a bishop with a fondness for metaphors, and one mathematician who spoke in riddles, could not reach consensus. Nevertheless, procedure required follow-up. A second team was sent to Cernbridge. They arrived in the early morning, camped near the barn, and conducted a thorough observation over 6 days. They saw 7 cows regularly. On Thursday, they claimed to hear lowing from beyond the mist, but when they approached, there was only silence and an overturned bucket. One scribe wrote that he dreamed of 14 cows, but awoke to find his inkpot spilled and his notes damp with dew. Their report was inconclusive, but rather than eliminate the cows from record, a compromise was made. The 7 uncertain cows were retained in the ledger, but marked with a small asterisk. Their tax status was deferred indefinitely. A note appended to the margin read, "Neither proven nor disproven, but gently regarded." Word spread. Poets were quick to seize the tale. A short ballad entitled "Cows of the Mist" became popular among students of the scribal arts. It told of creatures who wandered between the real and the almost real, who grazed in numbers uncertain, and whose presence could only be measured by faith. The refrain became part of auditor folklore: 7 in fog, 7 in tail, counted twice yet always pale. Over time, the cows took on a quiet symbolism. In auditor training halls, instructors used the story to teach humility in judgment. Among theologians, the cows were discussed as metaphors for transient truth. Even in the court, when asked about matters of uncertain evidence, some ministers were known to respond, "Let us consider the cows." As for Tholen, the steward, he continued his work with quiet persistence. He was once asked again about the cows and simply replied, "Some things are there when you look slowly." He passed away many winters later, his last ledger neat but incomplete. He left behind a barn, a field, and a mystery that no storm could wash away. And still today, in the Royal Archives, Northern Chamber, preserved under wax and careful fingers, the scroll remains. 14 cows, 7 bold, 7 faint. Next to them, in the gentlest ink, a line remains untouched, possibly visible on Thursdays. Let us now continue, from the fields of quiet uncertainty to an even stranger tradition that bloomed in the wake of the audit. For what began as record-keeping would soon become something more lyrical. In the next tale, we journey to a time when accounting was done in rhyme, and numbers began to dance with rhythm and verse. In the dim alcoves of medieval scriptoriums, where candle-light flickered across ink-stained fingers and parchment crinkled like old leaves, there came a peculiar tradition. It began as a whim, a whisper between weary clerks tired of rigid tables and endless scrutiny. And soon, it became a gentle revolution in verse. Not of swords or banners, but of couplets and rhymes, woven quietly into the ledgers of kingdoms. It started, as so many oddities do, in a forgotten corner of the realm. A minor tax clerk named Merwin of Ellsby found himself adrift in a sea of receipts and accusations. Audits came with alarming frequency, and even when his numbers were correct, they were questioned. His columns were neat, his ink fresh, yet no one believed. So one winter's evening, when the wind howled like hungry dogs beyond the shutters, Merwin decided to try something different. He composed his entire report as a poem. The figures were still there, tucked within the cadence of his words. But instead of dry enumeration, he offered gentle verse. To oxen yoked beneath a ewe, their steps were slow, their debt was due. When he submitted the scroll, the response was unexpected. His supervisor did not scold, instead, he smiled. The report was clear enough, but more importantly, it was pleasant to read. For once, the numbers sang, word traveled, carried not by herald but by curiosity. Other scribes tried their hand at this lyrical bookkeeping. They rhymed their taxes, they hummed their inventories. What had once been a solitary whim became a quiet tradition. In the village of Deepmer, a clerk wrote, 6 barrels dry, for still wet, stored beneath the baker's net. In Glomshire, another scribbled, 3 sheep lost beneath a ridge, perhaps they leapt from Farmer's Bridge. Soon, ledgers across the countryside began to rhyme, not with rebellion, but with weary joy. Of course, this new habit served another purpose. Wrapped in metaphor and alliteration, the numbers became harder to audit. Cross-referencing was no longer straightforward. What did it mean that a coin did glint and then was gone? Beneath the moonlight's hollow song. Was the coin lost, or spent, or perhaps never there? Auditors struggled, and the clerks, with innocent expressions and ink-dappled fingers, claimed only poetic truth. In some cases, it was artful evasion. In others, it was a defense against monotony. When days stretched long and complaints grew louder, a verse could soften the burden. A record of livestock theft might read, 2 goats vanished near the dell, with naught but silence left to tell. A shortage of wheat became, the granary sighed with sacks too few. As winds of hunger gently blew, there were, as always, those who objected. A particularly stern chancellor in the Northern Treasury declared the practice heretical. He demanded that all future reports be free of rhyme or rhythm. But even he, it was whispered, kept a small scroll of verses hidden in his robe. The scroll began, when numbers weep and ink does smear, the truth may yet in rhyme appear. In time, entire villages became known for their rhyming style. Some scribes composed sonnets, others favored ballads. A few even developed a ledger in limerick form, though this was frowned upon as too jovial for tax documentation. A favorite among collectors was the hamlet of Larkend, whose annual report read like a lullaby, 5 jars of honey, thick with gold, 2 cracked and 1 a bit too old. 6 hens clucked beneath the eaves, their eggs like treasures in the leaves. What made the practice endure was its humanity. Numbers alone were sharp, cold, and final, but in verse, they breathed. A debt was no longer a failure but a moment in a larger story. A surplus was not just abundance, but a cause for whispered celebration. The clerks, often invisible in the machinery of the realm, found voice in their verses. And their readers, even the most grizzled auditors, began to listen with softer eyes. A curious benefit emerged, because the poetic format made falsification more difficult to detect. Some villages took greater care to report accurately. After all, a lie in rhyme was harder to craft. Honesty became a kind of verse in itself. It is said that one village near the eastern coast hired a retired minstrel as their chief bookkeeper. His reports were near incomprehensible but undeniably beautiful. One excerpt read, "For candles burned at night's lament, 1 fell and waxed the church's rent. But prayers were paid in light, not gold, and so the tale is gently told." Entire collections of these ledgers have survived, stored in damp archives and monastic vaults. Historians pore over them, not just for data, but for insight into the moods and humor of the past. In one scroll from the winter of pale frost, the expenses for road repairs were listed thus: 2 wheels lost to frozen ruts, 3 more cracked from wooden guts. A plank was laid, then taken back, and used to mend a stable's crack. In the Royal Library of Aldborough, there remains a folio bound in blue velvet, filled with the tax rhymes of a particularly devoted scribe named Emlyn. She ended each section with a refrain, so write it down with careful hand, for coin and kin and grain and land. Her hand was steady, her lines even, and her rhymes gentle. A notation in the margin, penned by an admiring auditor, reads simply, "This one understood the soul of ink," but as all golden ages fade, so, too, did the era of rhymed ledgers. A new treasurer came to power, one who favored strict columns and direct language. He issued a decree: all reports must be in prose, no exceptions. The scrolls of poetry were quietly filed away, their verses slowly forgotten by those who favored speed and precision. Yet even today, some archivists recite lines from memory, as if the ledgers themselves were a kind of hymn. Perhaps the most famous verse, carved into the wooden edge of an old tax chest, goes as follows: "Write it plain or write it true, the numbers still remember you." But should you rhyme in ink so deep, the numbers just might let you sleep. As the tradition faded, so, too, did the gentle rebellion it represented. Yet it left behind a legacy, a reminder that even in the most rigid systems, creativity can find a home, that in the quiet corners of dusty rooms, among scrolls and inkpots and the weight of duty, someone once believed that numbers, too, could sing. And so, we turn from poetry to deception of a different kind. For while some scribes chose beauty to soften the burden of truth, others found clever ways to hide their errors within the folds of religion. In the next tale, we examine the curious case of the sacred pit and excavation that existed only on paper, and a budget that vanished beneath its imaginary soil. In the quiet folds of medieval history, there are entries in ledgers more curious than catastrophic, more poetic than precise. They are not tales of conquest or catastrophe, but of small peculiarities in parchment that whisper a very different story of the Middle Ages. Among them stands one particular entry, though delicately absurd and enduringly clever, that it continues to draw smiles from scholars centuries later. It was not a battle nor a feast, but a pit. Not a real pit, mind you, but a sacred one. One that existed only in the imagination, and yet consumed more coin than a chapel of stone. The village of Dunmere was small, nestled between salt wines and marsh grass. It had no fortress, no noble family, no cathedral tower to mark it on maps. What it did have was a clerk named Brother Ammon, a man with tired eyes and a talent for turning numbers into riddles. When the village faced a financial audit after failing to submit a complete tax register for 2 consecutive years, the pressure mounted. Expenditures were unaccounted for. Coin had been spent, receipts had vanished like dew. The villagers murmured of error, the officials muttered of fraud. Brother Ammon, however, offered an answer both serene and unprovable. He proposed that the village had begun a holy project, a religious site, a sacred excavation intended to be the foundation of a future shrine. The shrine itself would honor silence, or stillness, or perhaps the unknowable presence of divinity in empty spaces. The details were never nailed down, and that, Ammon explained gently, was part of the sanctity. True holiness could not be measured, much less scheduled or audited, so it was recorded in the ledger. Funds allocated to the preparation of sacred site. Ground not yet broken in observance of contemplative waiting. In the margins, a note read, "May not be visible to the untrained eye." When the royal auditors arrived that spring, they were shown a flat piece of ground behind the old grain store, where nothing had been moved except perhaps a snail's path in the dew. Brother Ammon bowed solemnly and whispered about intention. The auditors, sensing something vaguely divine, nodded and returned to their horses without further questioning. That entry, innocuous and ridiculous in equal measure, became something of a legend. Other villages heard of it and took inspiration. A holy well appeared in the records of Wexbury, though no water was ever found. A temple of deferred judgment was mentioned in Selwick, though its location changed every year. These fictitious structures gained real fiscal weight. They allowed for the absorption of unexpected costs, the concealment of mistakes, and the quiet redirection of funds with a blessed halo. This practice came to be known among scribes as ecclesiastical abstraction. It was not quite deceit and not quite piety, but rather a middle ground where the soul of bureaucracy danced lightly with theology. A barrel of wine, purchased for morale, might be listed as liquid for spiritual elevation. Candles used during a late-night feast could be recorded as illumination for sacred reflection. These phrases soothed the conscience and baffled the investigators. What made the sacred pit of Dunmere so compelling was that it never tried to become more. It remained undug. No foundation was laid. No fence was built. No sign was carved. And yet, year after year, modest sums were assigned to its preparation. Clearing weeds, planning stone arrangements, contemplative silence for spiritual alignment. All phrases that required no materials and generated no receipts. It was a ledger's dream and a cynic's nightmare. Eamon's ledgers themselves became artifacts. His handwriting was steady, his ink lightly faded but always legible. One surviving page, now held in a university archive, lists expenses such as listening to the earth, watching for divine signals, and tea for the watchers. The sums were small but consistent. It is estimated that over 15 years, the village spent enough on the sacred pit to have built an actual shrine 3 times over. Yet no one complained. The illusion brought them comfort. It softened the sharper truths of mismanagement and allowed errors to be sanctified. Other scribes began to imitate Eamon's phrasing. A school in Northmere began using the term anticipated divinity to refer to an unbuilt library. In Port Lambridge, a failed mill project was listed as potential energy contained in faith. The language became poetic, lyrical, sometimes humorous, but always careful, always just vague enough to slip past doubt. At first, some higher officials tried to crack down. A directive was issued requiring physical inspection of all sites marked for religious development, but this only led to new creativity. Clerks began placing small stones in fields, lighting incense during inspections, or inviting auditors to kneel in prayer before nothing at all. The auditors, whether due to confusion or a desire to avoid confrontation, usually reported their visits as satisfactory. It was, in a way, a performance, a shared agreement that some things were better left unquestioned, that a space which claimed to honor the invisible should perhaps remain invisible. And behind this quiet pact, the accounts were balanced. The mistakes were buried, the village continued. Historians argue over whether this practice should be seen as fraud or folklore. Perhaps it was both, but it did not arise from greed. It came from a desire to preserve harmony, to soften the glare of failure, to place human error within a framework of beauty. The sacred pit was not an escape from truth. It was a way of giving error a place to rest. Over time, Brother Ammon aged. His beard grew long and white, his ink grew lighter, he added fewer notes. Eventually, his final ledger contained only one line: the silence remains, no date, no sum, no annotations. That was the last mention of the pit. Within a few years, the next clerk closed the account and reassigned the funds to road repairs. And yet, long after the books were shelved, people still spoke of the sacred pit. Children were told not to run through the field behind the grain store, for it was holy. Old men paused there on walks and looked into the wind. Women left herbs at the edge of the grass, though none recalled why. The pit had never existed, but it had become real. Not in stone, but in story, not in earth, but in mind. And so, we leave the quiet emptiness behind and turn the page to a different kind of silence. Not one built on abstraction, but on anonymity. In the next tale, we open a ledger without a name, a journal filled with the same phrase, repeated again and again, a soft echo of exhaustion across time. Join me as we step into the worn notes of a clerk whose only testimony was 3 simple words: I have tried. In the deep silence of a forgotten archive room, far from the chant of monks and the murmur of market towns, rested a ledger unlike any other. It did not contain lists of grain or sheep, nor the daily expenses of a monastery or manor. It bore no name, no date, no signature, and yet, for those who discovered it centuries later, it held something strangely profound, a quiet testimony to the limits of human effort and the endurance of honest failure. It came to be known simply as the Ledger of Trying. Bound in thin leather with a clasp that had long since rusted open, the book was delicate but whole. Its parchment pages were stiff and dry, smelling faintly of candle wax and ink dust. Scholars who found it had expected numbers, transactions, perhaps even a map of long-lost debts. But what they found instead was something far more arresting. On the first page, carefully inked in a hand neither ornate nor clumsy, were 2 words and a pronoun: I tried. Below it, silence. No annotation, no figures, just those words. Turning the page revealed the same: I tried, again and again. Sometimes a line neatly to the center, sometimes a little to the left, or arched slightly as if the writer's wrist had begun to ache. In some places the ink ran faint, as if the pen had run dry or the light had failed, but there it was, repeated again: I tried, I tried. Page after page, unwavering and spare. It was not the work of madness, nor did it seem to be a joke. The hand remained consistent, even when tired. The spacing was deliberate, the lines unhurried. Each repetition seemed to ask not for attention, but for understanding. Whoever had written the ledger had not sought to be heard by many, only not to be forgotten completely. Some pages carried small blemishes, a faint blot where a tear might have fallen, a fingerprint smudged in the margin, a subtle crease suggesting that the page had once been folded and unfolded, perhaps in hesitation. On one page, near the middle, the ink trailed off mid-stroke, only for the next page to begin again with quiet steadiness. I tried. Monks who came upon the book centuries after its creation did not discard it. They preserved it carefully, as they would a prayer scroll or the fragment of a saint's garment. They did not shelve it with the usual ledgers. Instead, it was kept in a quiet alcove near the scriptorium, where younger brothers were sometimes sent when overwhelmed by the pressure of their duties. Sit with the trying book, they were told. Let it speak to you. And it did speak, not in explanation, but in echo. For who has not, in some forgotten hour, whispered to themselves the same small mantra, I tried, when tasks multiply and expectations grow heavy, when the sums do not align and the quill trembles, when faith wavers, when effort ends with emptiness, I tried. Scholars have offered many interpretations. Some believe the ledger was begun by a clerk burdened with impossible demands, a tax roll gone awry, a monastery's dwindling coffers, a noble's changing orders, and perhaps, after realizing the work could not be completed, he chose to document not the figures, but his persistence. Others suggest it was a private devotional act, a form of penance, or prayer. To write I tried over and over, not to justify oneself to the world, but to lay bare the soul to God, among struggling with the vow of humility, or obedience, or simply with the frailty of his own will. In that view, each phrase was a pebble in a quiet stream of repentance. There are even those who see it as resistance, a way of saying that the system itself was too tangled to serve, that the records were false, or meaningless, or cruel. And so, rather than fabricate numbers, the writer offered only truth, that he had tried, and that must be enough. Whatever its origin, the book became beloved in hushed ways, not celebrated, not preached from, but remembered. On feast days, some abbeys began the tradition of copying the phrase onto scraps of parchment and leaving them at altars. In one village, it was said that a dying scribe asked for the words to be sewn into his burial shroud, and among traveling friars, the phrase became a quiet shorthand for compassion. I tried, they would say when they could offer no other help, and it was understood. Modern historians marvel at its endurance. The ledger is not rich in historical data. It tells us little about crops or conflicts, politics or trade. And yet, it feels more human than many grander chronicles. In its silence, it contains the shape of effort. In its repetition, it honors fatigue. It holds space for those who worked in shadows and whose only gift to history is the testimony of their intent. In the margins of some pages, faint marks suggest that later readers added their own gestures. A flower pressed between sheets, a single fingerprint in wax, the careful fold of a corner as if to mark a favorite repetition. On the final page, the handwriting shifts ever so slightly. The words, "I tried," are followed by a single period and then a gap. And in that space, untouched, is the quietest moment of all, an ending not forced, but accepted. We may never know who wrote the ledger, but we know they were tired, we know they were honest, and above all, we know they were there, in some candle-lit room, facing a task they could not finish, and choosing to respond not with excuse or anger, but with effort. Not to vanish, but to remain, to leave behind something small and gentle and true. Let that be a measure, then, not of success, but of sincerity, not of triumph, but of trying. The world turns on efforts we never see, on ledgers we never open, on hands that lift the quill and write what little they can before the light fades. And if all that is left is the phrase, "I tried," then perhaps that is enough. Now, as we gently close the final page of the trying ledger, we turn now to a different form of quiet rebellion, a tale not of repetition, but of revision, of clerks who rewrote time itself to save themselves from blame. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the curious confusion caused by calendar manipulation, a story of silent resistance etched in ink and dates. There are many ways to resist a crown. Some wield swords, others craft speeches. But in the forgotten alcoves of medieval administration, there was a quieter form of defiance, one that did not shout, but whispered through the lines of ink and the shifting sands of time. It began not in a battlefield or a council chamber, but in the cramped and candle-lit desks of accountants who had, perhaps, reached the end of their patience. Their weapon was not steel, but the calendar. The earliest clues surfaced in the royal archives of Westerford, where a team of scribes had long maintained records of land tax, tolls, and inventories dating back 100 years. A curious young archivist noticed a problem. According to the ledgers, a single knight had been stationed at the distant border towns at the same time. Another entry claimed a barley shipment arrived 3 weeks before it had been requested, and a royal feast had apparently occurred on the feast of St. Elric, a holiday that had not yet been invented. At first, these anomalies were brushed aside. Errors were not uncommon in a time when candles flickered and quills dried mid-stroke. But as more ledgers were examined, a pattern emerged. Entire clusters of dates did not match. Some repeated. Some skipped days altogether. Some drifted weeks into the future, or receded months into the past. The years themselves seemed to blur and bend. An entire decade, it appeared, had become something like a hall of mirrors, reflections of what might have happened, but in no certain order. It was not sabotage in the usual sense. The entries were neat, the math was clean, but the dates had become a forest of shifting trees, where time wandered off the path and the past no longer stood still. Historians would later call it the minor temporal confusion, a curious phenomenon where nothing had been destroyed, but much had been misplaced. As scholars traced the discrepancies backward, they discovered that the alterations had not occurred all at once. Instead, over the span of several seasons, accountants across the realm had begun quietly adjusting the dates of their entries, not by years, but by days. Sometimes by a week, sometimes only by an hour. Yet the effect, compounded across hundreds of ledgers and dozens of towns, was significant. Events overlapped, decisions were delayed or accelerated. In one curious case, a tax was issued before it had been written. But why had this happened? The answer, as with most subtle rebellions, lay not in policy but in pressure. Medieval accounting was not a forgiving profession. Mistakes were punished, discrepancies were questioned, and dates, those delicate stamps of responsibility, were often used to assign blame. If a tax was collected too late, the date on the ledger was the gallows. If a shipment arrived before payment, the date was the hammer. If a feast occurred without provision, the date was the rope. And so, in quiet corners where fear lived close to fatigue, some accountants began to bend the line of time. One ledger from the port town of Fenton listed a shipment of salted herring arriving on the 12th of May, yet its sale was recorded on the 10th. The marginal note simply read, "All present and accounted for." Time is flexible. In the inland town of Wybrook, a book of fines was found to repeat the date of the 7th of June for 6 consecutive pages. When asked why, the scribe replied, "It was a very long day." The changes were never dramatic enough to spark outrage. They were small missteps, just out of reach of discipline. But as more and more clerks adopted the habit, the effect spread like quiet laughter in a solemn room. By the time the Crown noticed, it was impossible to untangle which dates were true, which payments were late, who had failed, and who had been clever. Attempts were made to enforce stricter dating procedures. Royal edicts demanded that all ledgers be signed with the phase of the moon and the temperature of the day. One particularly poetic decree requested that scribes also include the position of migratory birds at the time of recording. These measures, though elaborate, only deepened the confusion. Some clerks, in jest or protest, began drawing birds directly onto the page, declaring the tax paid during the flight of the southern finch. The silent rebellion reached its peak during what came to be known as the uncertain winter. For 6 weeks, no two towns agreed on what day it was. Markets opened and closed unpredictably. Couriers arrived before they had departed. A royal marriage, scheduled for the 3rd of December, was attended by guests on the 8th and written into the chronicles as occurring on the 5th. The bride herself simply smiled and said, "It was a beautiful day," whichever one it was. When the chaos became too pronounced to ignore, the Crown convened a council of clerks to uncover the source. But the records they brought were riddled with gaps and loops, each one accurate and false in equal measure. One ledger bore the phrase, "Date to be decided later," written beneath each entry. Another simply stated, "It was that day." You remember, no one was punished, there was no trial. For how could one condemn confusion when it had been authored by consensus? Instead, the council issued a polite clarification. From that day forward, the Crown declared, time would be referred to in approximate certainty. The term caught on. Festivals were planned sometime around next full moon. Taxes were collected in the fortnight adjacent to harvest, and history, for a time, became a story told without exact chapters. Modern scholars still puzzle over the rebellion. Some call it a comedy of errors. Others see it as a philosophical statement, a gentle reminder that time, like truth, is often shaped by those who record it. But most agree that it was not a mistake, nor a prank. It was, in its own quiet way, a refusal. A statement made not with shouting, but with shifting ink and uncertain days. What endured was not the confusion, but the message beneath it, that sometimes, when the weight of precision becomes unbearable, people will bend the rules just enough to breathe. That even in a world ruled by orders and audits, there is space for human softness, and that behind every calendar entry, there might be a soul trying not to falter under the pressure of perfect timing. As we leave behind the tangled timelines of those defiant clerks, we step into the shadows once more. In our next tale, we meet those who formed a brotherhood in the margins, gathering in secret to laugh gently at the numbers they carefully misaligned. A society not of secrecy, but of slight adjustments. Not all brotherhoods wore armor or sang in stone chapels. Some formed silently, in corners filled with parchment and dust. Their bond was not made through battles, but through gentle decisions made in ledgers. In the quiet aftermath of the calendar confusion that had softly unraveled the very idea of time, a curious circle began to take shape. They claimed no title, waved no banner, but they shared a conscience, and left behind a legacy not in declarations, but in subtle signs. They came to be known never officially, always in whispers as the Order of the Slightly Adjusted Totals. It is said the order began with an error so minor, it almost didn't matter. A clerk named Mervyn, tired and hunched in candle light, transposed a digit in the royal stables feed budget. The sacks became 20. The horses were delighted. The treasurers were baffled, but when asked, Mervyn shrugged and simply said, "It seemed kinder that way." His colleagues didn't report him. Instead, they laughed quietly, as if recognizing something they had each once done. A mercy rounded upward, a fine quietly erased, a toll postponed on a freezing day. Stories like Mervyn's began to circulate in the quiet corners of accountancy. Little choices made not from laziness, but from kindness. A clerk in the northern provinces erased widow's debts with poetic notes like "paid in silence" or "settled by sorrow." Another adjusted punishment fees with cryptic phrases "balance waived in light of decency" or "account forgiven at dusk." These adjustments were not grand, nor defiant, but they softened the sharpness of a system built on precision and severity. Their fellowship grew not from doctrine, but from recognition. They met not in temples or courts, but in the ledgers themselves. Their signs were coded into handwriting: a tilted 7, a curled 5, a redundant 0 added with care. They communicated across vast distances through invisible flourishes. Only those trained in the discipline of numbers would notice. Only those who looked not just at sums but at intentions would understand. The order left no manifestos, only margins. Their resistance was soft, but it endured. When they could, they met in person, never twice in the same place. Sometimes beneath vineyards, other times in scriptoriums during the new moon. Always quiet, always hidden, they brought no badges, only stories. Stories of softened edges, of errors made with empathy. They spoke while stirring broth or mending sleeves. No one confessed, no one boasted. If someone had adjusted a total to keep a family in their home, it was accepted. If someone had deleted a tax line to spare a grieving widow, it was honored. No applause, just understanding. There were no ranks among them, only roles that drifted like wind. One gathering might be led by a monk who once altered a census to include those left unseen by plague. Another, by a woman who taught children to count, but forgot her own debts to offer them better shoes. The only motto they ever scribbled, in the margin of a livestock account, reads simply, "What is truth, if not rounded?" Not sarcasm, but compassion, for truth in numbers, they believed, should never be sharper than the people it counted. Sometimes, their work was noticed. A royal auditor might frown at a page that balanced too perfectly, a deduction that appeared without source. When questioned, the scribe would merely nod and say, "That is what was written." Rarely did it go further. Who would unwind a kindness? Who would call cruelty into a sum that had already settled peacefully? Their defense was the fragility of memory itself. Even the gods of coin and cattle, they joked, looked the other way sometimes. In time, apprentices whispered of the order. A novice in a faraway abbey found words scratched above his desk. "If it feels too cruel, smooth the sum." In another scriptorium, a false ledger was created, filled with imagined kindnesses in accounting, and buried beneath the floor as a secret blessing for those who would come next. The order spread not through orders or edicts, but through echoes. It was not organized, it breathed in paper, in gesture, in shared silence. Of course, not all approved. Some voices in the royal court called the order a danger, a threat to the honesty of records, but their outrage rarely reached far. The noise of protest often faded beneath the gentle sound of quills scratching parchment. For those who had ever balanced a ledger late into the night knew that exactness, without care, its own form of failure. The world does not always need a perfect count. Sometimes, it needs a kind one. No one knows when the order dissolved, if it ever truly did. Its traces flicker still, a will adjusted in favor of someone long forgotten. A village spared a tax that should have been owed. A page missing from a record, leaving only a whisper behind. Some say the order lives on not in institutions, but in the moments where compassion outweighs compliance, in the decisions no one sees, in the mercy that no one records. In the great stories of kings and wars, the order is never named. But in the margins, they endure. They did not rewrite laws or reshape empires. They simply made the ledgers a little softer, and in doing so, made the world a little more bearable. Their legacy is not carved in stone, but tucked gently between the lines. Not as fraud, but as fragments of care, as small mercies whispered in ink across centuries of silence. And now, as we leave behind the quiet footprints of this peculiar fellowship, we step toward a chapter stranger still. For in the dust and silence of those same record rooms, another presence grew, a presence with whiskers and paws. In the next part of our journey, we turn to the cats of medieval bookkeeping. Warm, watchful, and mysteriously ever-present. Guardians of scrolls, companions to scribes, and perhaps the most honest auditors of all. In the quiet corners of medieval record-keeping, beneath shelves of parchment and beside flickering oil lamps, there walked a companion whose contribution to the world of numbers was never officially logged, yet always appreciated. With paws padded in silence and eyes like moonlight through stained glass, the cat held a place of quiet honor among the scribes and stewards of the realm. Their presence was not mandated, nor trained, but invited by the natural balance of need and comfort. And thus, across countless abbeys and counting houses, cats became the unsung allies of accountants. Their usefulness was first noted not in records, but in the absence of small troubles. Where grain was stored near books, where ink sat beside cheese and candles, there too came the mouse. And with the mouse came the risk not only to provisions, but to parchment. One nibble could erase a line of figures. A nest behind a shelf could turn last year's budget into bedding. But where a cat settled, silence followed. The scurry stopped, the balance was preserved. Yet the role of the cat went beyond pest control. They were warmth in a cold ledger room, where stones held the memory of winter long into spring. A cat curled upon a lap brought heat where fire did not reach. Their weight, subtle and steady, anchored the scribe's focus, reminding him to remain still, to breathe, to write carefully. A tail flicking gently across the table could signal a needed pause, a moment to recheck the sum or sip the cooling broth beside the ink. Some clerks began to observe patterns in feline behavior. When a cat stretched and turned 3 times before leaping from a table, it was said to be an omen that a number had been written twice. If a cat knocked a scroll from the shelf, the account it held was believed to require review. And if a cat refused to enter a particular room, that ledger's accuracy was doubted until proven otherwise. Over time, these soft instincts became a kind of second sense among scribes, a partnership not taught, but felt. In certain abbeys, cats earned nicknames that mirrored their surroundings. There was Debit, a ginger tabby who liked to nap atop the expense reports. There was Quill, a sleek black mouser who once chased a moth across the chancellor's seal, leaving a paw print in the wax. At the Abbey of St. Laurent, an elderly gray cat named Ledger was allowed to rest atop the treasury chest itself, a privilege denied to all novices and most senior monks. When Ledger passed, the abbey held a short service and declared him most faithful of staff. Their presence became so common that ledgers themselves occasionally recorded them. One entry from a northern poet read, "Office warmed by cat. No further heating required." Another noted, "Mice absent this quarter. Credit to resident feline." A whimsical scribe in a river town once illustrated a marginal note, a sketch of a cat perched upon an abacus, tail looped like a question mark, eyes wide as if contemplating a tax. But perhaps most intriguingly, cats served another purpose, one not discussed openly, but understood. They became, in many quarters, informal indicators of supervision. For cats are keen observers. They notice movement before men do. Their ears twitch toward footsteps long before the sound is clear. And so, when a supervisor or auditor approached, it was often the cat who reacted first, a sudden jump from the table, a focused stare toward the door, a tail stiffening just so. For scribes immersed in the rhythmic quiet of numbers, these signs were subtle alerts. Time to straighten the column. Time to correct the margin. time to appear exact. Thus, among certain circles, cats came to be regarded as sentinels. They required no oath, they spoke no warning, but their presence held meaning. A ledger said to be watched by the cat was one kept with care. A desk often visited by a purring visitor was said to be blessed with clarity. And when a particularly chaotic record room was discovered without feline inhabitants, the phrase "no cat, no order" began to circulate as both joke and caution. There were also, of course, legends, tales of cats who disrupted dishonest accounts, who knocked false ledgers into fire, who scratched at the pages where numbers had been altered too boldly. One monastery claimed their tabby once ruined a set of forged receipts by curling upon them while the ink was wet. The result was a blur of furl-ein streaks that made the deception plain. Another scribe wrote, with both humor and humility, was preparing to hide an error when the cat placed paw upon page. Took it as judgment, adjusted the total, too many. This might seem fanciful, but for those who lived among scrolls and silence, who labored with precision while the world outside moved with the looseness of weather and war, the companionship of the cat was not luxury, it was alignment. A soft presence that mirrored the steady hand, a quiet body that understood stillness, a gaze that, without knowing, judged rightly. Some abbeys began leaving small bowls of cream beside the record tables. Not every cat accepted. Some came only for a moment, brushing against the leg of the bookkeeper before vanishing into the rafters. Others lingered for years, appearing at the same hour each day as if they too observed the cycles of budgeting and prayer. A few were even included in the annual inventory, listed between the candle reserves and ink jars. One cat, Gray, named some. When the night grew long and entries blurred, a cat's purring could become a lullaby. The steady rise and fall of its breath a reminder to close the book, to return tomorrow with clearer eyes. And in that rhythm, numbers softened. The ledger, once a battlefield of debt and obligation, became instead a record of people trying, failing, and trying again, with a cat beside them, indifferent to the outcomes, but constant in presence. Today, few ledgers mention cats. The accounts have grown sterile, the ink digital, the rooms fluorescent and without corners for napping. But now and then, a clerk leaves a chair empty beside their desk, a warm spot where memory curls, and in that absence, something ancient lingers. So let us remember the ones with paws who kept the books warm, who startled at footsteps before they were heard, who judged not the sum but the hands that wrote them, the cats of accounting, guardians of quiet balance. And now, as we leave behind this gentle tale of purring companions and silent warnings, we move toward a stranger experiment. In the next chapter, we meet a poet who was, for 1 month only, made chief accountant. The result was lyrical, beautiful, even, but profoundly unhelpful. In the gentle but occasionally disordered memory of the medieval treasury, one tale rests like a misplaced bookmark in a ledger, the time they appointed a court poet to manage the kingdom's finances. It happened during a soft and misty month, when the royal accountant fell mysteriously ill after an unfortunate incident involving moldy ink and a disagreement over turnip tariffs. With urgency, but little wisdom, the court of tallies looked for a temporary replacement. The scribes were overworked, the monks too silent, and the nobles too invested in falconry. And so, for reasons no one would later claim, the choice fell to Alwyn, the royal poet. Alwyn had a reputation for turning sunsets into stanzas and tears into couplets. He was beloved by queens and admired by gardeners. He wore soft brown robes and always paused before speaking. He had never balanced a budget or signed an invoice, but he once wrote a sonnet comparing sorrow to falling leaves that caused even the chancellor to weep softly into his stew. When asked if he was familiar with arithmetic, he responded vaguely about the rhythm of raindrops and the cadence of wind. Misunderstanding his poetry for practicality, they handed him the ink-pot of office. His first act was to change the appearance of the royal account book. Instead of dry parchment marked with columns and sums, he bound it in velvet and pressed lavender into the pages. He titled it Echoes of Silver and Other Movements of Worth. Inside, he did not begin with numbers or titles, but with a gentle prelude about how money, like love, must be sent forth with trust. His script flowed like river banks in spring, delicate and unhurried. The first entry reads simply, "Coins flutter like birds into markets unknown." The clerks, confused but too polite to protest, watched as Alwyn turned every transaction into metaphor. A shipment of bricks was recorded as stones in silent march toward warmth. A soldier's rations became grain wrapped in the promise of strength. The phrase 6 barrels of cider received transformed into 6 barrels waiting. Under shade of moss and dusk, dream of empty cups. At first, the court was enchanted. The queen requested several verses for embroidery, and foreign guests were presented with translated ledgers as tokens of peace. The chancellor even began reading Alwyn's entries during evening meals, much to the delight of visiting barons who appreciated literature more than accuracy. But outside the palace, merchants began to worry. No one could tell whether payments had been made or promised, received or merely dreamed. One butter supplier returned with a poem that had been issued in lieu of coin. It read, "The churn forgets now, cream once turned with morning songs." But no gold was found. He asked if this meant he had been paid or was being philosophically postponed. The bakers complained that the flour order had returned as a haiku about clouds. Even the palace cook, a woman usually unfazed by royal peculiarities, refused to read another sonnet when all she needed was 24 eggs and a cheese wheel. The final straw arrived in the form of a haiku handed to the military quartermaster, who had come for the year's inventory. It read, "Blades asleep in dust, March waits with unanswered breath. Steel hums in silence." The quartermaster, a direct man with no appreciation for subtlety, declared the accounting process void and stormed out without a signature. The couriers began rejecting payment poems outright, demanding exact coin or written confirmation with verifiable numerals. Tension grew. The kingdom's transactions dissolved into metaphor, and the markets began to whisper that Ireland had lost its mind. At last, the court of coin summoned Breda, the assistant clerk who had worked beside Alwyn in silence throughout his poetic experiment. She had, in secret, kept her own book, one filled not with verse, but with reconstructed numbers she extracted from Alwyn's lyrical trails. When asked how she managed, she simply said, "I listened to the breath of the numbers between his lines." Her approximations proved accurate enough to rescue the realm's financial memory. The merchants were paid, the flour was ordered, the chickens rejoiced. Alwyn, for his part, took the dismissal gently. He expressed only mild disappointment that his haiku about hoof tax would never be published and returned to the garden to write about bees and weather on his final page as royal accountant. Beneath Brida's tidy sums, he left a final line, "Not all coins clang. Some fall quietly in dreams, where ledgers cannot go." Though his financial record was deemed impractical, Alwyn's influence lingered. For years after, scribes would write opening lines in their ledgers with a touch of elegance. Young accountants practiced decorative handwriting. In certain towns, it became fashionable to write tax warnings in rhymed couplets to soften their sting. A village near the coast even printed dual ledgers, one official, one poetic. The poetic ledgers were never used in court, but they were read aloud during town festivals, to the delight of school children and night watchmen alike. In Bristolin, where Alwyn's poem about salt exports became a local favorite, children memorized it instead of multiplication tables. One teacher insisted that understanding the beauty of currency helped students respect its weight. Whether it was true or not, it made arithmetic lessons quieter. Traders began quoting verses during negotiations, usually out of context, but always with a smile. Some even left coin on the table accompanied by folded scraps of verse, offering both payment and poetry. Years passed, and Alwyn became a gentle myth. His brief tenure was remembered not as a failure, but as a season of softness in a world of precision. The season of soft sums, as it came to be called, reminded people that numbers could be more than cold. They could be warm with intention, they could dance, if only briefly. A statue was raised in the palace garden, a stone figure of a man seated with a quill, eyes closed, ledger open, and a daisy resting beside the ink pot. The plaque beneath read, "The sum may vanish, but the line of beauty stays, in ink and in heart." As this chapter draws to a close, let us remember the quiet miracle of it. That for 1 month in a tidy little kingdom, poetry ruled the treasury. And while the grain was late and the butter uncertain, the spirit of accounting gained a whisper of grace. Even now, somewhere in a forgotten archive, a velvet-bound book still sleeps, filled with verses no one understands, but no one dares throw away. In a narrow room at the very back of the Abbey of Silver Hill, where dust rested undisturbed on ledgers older than memory, there sat a shelf marked simply "Records Unmatched." It was here in a season of soft rain that a novice archivist named Edra found something odd. The book was slim, bound in old hide, with no title on the spine. It bore a wax seal shaped like a rose with 3 thorns, and inside were no words, only Roman numerals arranged not by date nor by amount, but in delicate patterns. The pages began with I to 3-4, then seemed to scatter without reason. At first Edra thought it an unfinished account, or perhaps the work of a clerk who never learned to spell, but the deeper she read the more she began to sense a rhythm beyond calculation. The numerals were spaced with care. Some stood alone as if they marked singular events, while others clustered densely on the page like whispered sentences said in haste. Sometimes a line would stretch with only one numeral repeated 3 times, such as 15, 15, 15, followed by a long silence, and then a single X. In one section a sequence descended by 2, then ascended by 3, and repeated this motion for 6 pages, as if the writer had been caught between regret and hope. The book held no names, no explanations, no currency, and yet it felt full. Edra, who had sorted tax rolls and livestock counts for years, recognized patterns of thought, not transaction. This was not about coin or crop or cloth. It was about time and perhaps love. The abbey permitted her to study the book more closely. She traced the sequences onto parchment, copying each numeral with reverence. Her candle burned low night after night as she attempted to map the shapes of the numbers as if decoding a constellation. She began to suspect that each numeral marked a meeting or a message. Groupings around Beltane and Lammas hinted at summer rituals and possibly hidden meetings. A series of repeated 20 entries aligned with market days in Brislin, a coastal town once known for hosting traveling minstrels and secret lovers. Was the book a record of presence or absence? Edra wondered. Did each numeral say, "I was here," or "You were not"? Other scholars joined her in the quiet obsession. One monk suggested the book might be music, each numeral a note in a melody never played aloud. Another proposed that the spacing was geographical, not temporal, and tried to map the numbers to old roads and paths. A third quietly claimed the numerals mirrored heartbeat rhythms, and that the book was written not for the mind, but for the pulse. But Edra thought of it more simply. She believed the numbers were a conversation carried across seasons. The silence between entries spoke as loudly as the pages filled with repetition. There was longing in the gaps, joy in the sudden clusters, and sorrow in the isolated sevens. Toward the middle of the book there was a sudden shift. The entries grew dense, marked by a near-frantic pattern of 13-14, 13-14, 13-12, then abruptly ceased. 5 blank pages followed. Then slowly, as if breathing again, the numbers returned in gentle ascent. 15, 16, 17. Edra called this the falling out, and the forgiveness. She did not know their names, but she believed a people had once lived through these numbers. One entry near the end bore the shape of a heart, though formed only with numerals arranged in symmetry. It read Ixshi 13, 15, 13 X. This was no tax form. No date was ever confirmed for the book. Its binding hinted at the 12th century, but the ink varied, suggesting it had been added to over many years. At the very last page in faded brown was written 2 initials and no surname, no crest, just the simplest of claims. The abbey's older records made no reference to any romance of note, nor did local poems or court logs mention a couple with such initials. Some suspected it was a private courtship forbidden, perhaps across classes or between rival families. Others thought it might have been a widowed scribe's memorial to a partner lost to time or word. Despite the mystery, no one doubted the sincerity of the book. A visiting bishop once called it a ledger of the heart. He spent an hour with the book, and left behind a gold coin though no fee had been asked. A young acolyte later said she dreamed of the book's pages rearranging themselves into a map that led not to treasure, but to a bench in a garden where someone once waited. Even skeptics found themselves hushed in its presence. There was something fragile about the way the numerals lay on the page, something that suggested emotion carefully folded into silence. Over time, the book became known as the Ledger of Numerals. It was not kept among the tax records or legal volumes, but given its own glass case near the abbey's reading room. Pilgrims rarely came for it, but those who did often sat in silence for long hours simply gazing at the quiet language. A scholar once tried to translate the entire volume into verse, but abandoned the attempt after realizing that any word would limit the meaning. Some things are clearer without explanation, he wrote. Some love stories are best left in code. And yet even as the book defied interpretation, it inspired others. A tradition began among scribes to end their ledgers with a single numeral written without explanation. It was said to honor the unknown lovers and to remind all record keepers that numbers can carry feeling. A merchant from Dren once left a will written entirely in numerals, and his children believed it was a final puzzle meant to bring them together. In the town of Harwood, couples would exchange copied pages from the Ledger of Numerals as tokens. During quiet ceremonies unbound by clergy or law, one winter Edra grew ill and knew her time near the ledgers was ending. She requested to be buried not with her family, but near the abbey garden where wild lavender grew and bees hummed without witness. Her only possession was a folded page she had copied from the ledger long ago. On one side she had written the numerals 1919 and on the back simply the words, "I was here." After her passing, the abbey held a small reading where each numeral from the book was spoken aloud in sequence. The hall was silent except for the steady rhythm of time transformed into voice. Today, the ledger remains unreadable, but not unloved. Its mystery rests like a soft fog over the minds of those who see it. In a world of bold statements and loud truths, it offers something quieter. A reminder that not all things must be named to be known, that some of the deepest affections are recorded not in declarations, but in the subtle placement of symbols over time. And perhaps the greatest love stories are not those shouted from towers, but those that live in between numerals written by hands. Too shy to say the words aloud. So, if you ever find a book without language resting among forgotten scrolls, take a moment to look for the heart beneath the count. Somewhere in the quiet march of numerals may be the record of someone waiting and someone remembering, someone who found a way to speak through silence. In the quiet shadows of medieval record-keeping there existed a lesser-known, but widely practiced discipline among royal scribes and provincial accountants. It was not the art of calculation nor the science of ledgers, but something far more elusive. It was the refined and quietly necessary art of blame. In the world of worn scrolls and flickering candlelight, mistakes were inevitable and correction was dangerous. To confess a miscount might lead to a scolding, a fine, or in extreme cases a cage. But to redirect blame with subtlety and grace was considered a sign of maturity. The novice learned sums, the seasoned learned survival. The earliest records of displaced blame came from the southern duchies, where a tax collector reported 3 missing goats to a fog too dense to number through. Another cited a miscount of wheat sacks because bells had rung at the wrong time and startled the village tallyman. The ledgers accepted these explanations without question. Nature, after all, was not under jurisdiction. By the time of the Silver Hill, reformed scribes had developed entire vocabularies for misfortune. A delayed shipment became the result of divine wines. A torn invoice was explained by the mournful sigh of a window left ajar. This quiet tradition spread through monasteries and Courthouses where younger scribes were gently instructed not only in numerals, but in narratives. Manuals from the Abbey of Ventmore included entire chapters titled Circumstances Most Believable and When to Invoke Providence. One noted entry advised that a missing receipt could reasonably be attributed to candle wax or an ambitious mouse. Another stressed the importance of seasonal excuses. Winter brought snow-damaged, spring brought floods, summer welcomed ravens, and autumn was filled with rumors of curses. Every month bore its scapegoat. With time the practice grew ornate. Mistakes were no longer hidden, but decorated. A simple ink blot was accompanied by an entry describing how light had danced on the page, confusing the pen. A misaligned column was blamed on the procession of saints that passed the window. The language of blame turned poetic. Instead of writing a number was misread, one would write the sum wore the disguise of another. This transformation of error into metaphor not only softened suspicion, but made the reader pause. And a pausing inspector was often a forgiving one. Soon enough these flourishes became expected. Nobles began to enjoy the inventive justifications in their household records. One lord remarked that his accounts were more entertaining than his chapel sermons. Another demanded that all mistakes be written in rhymed couplets. It was no longer about avoiding blame, but mastering it with charm. The best scribes could turn an absence of payment into a parable of pilgrimage. They could render lost numbers as acts of fate. In this way, the accountants became artists, and each ledger a gallery of graceful deflection. A quiet brotherhood emerged, though no seal declared them. They were the practitioners of the slight excuse. Known only by whispers among scribes, they passed fragments of phrases that had proven effective. Phrases like "time did falter" or "the entry was shy today" became signals of alliance. These gentle codes protected the writer without revealing intention. When one accountant in the port city of Bristol was accused of embezzling, he offered only a single line in response. The coin traveled before the ink could record. No further questions were asked. Of course, not all blame was safe. There were those who dared to assign fault upward, blaming delays on noble whims or royal decrees. These brave scribes often found their ledgers mysteriously missing or their candles snuffed before dawn, but others learned to tread carefully, using phrases like "as per instruction unstated" or "in accordance with unseen design." These allowed them to hint at pressure without naming the source. It was a dance of shadows on vellum, and those who danced best remained employed and unharmed. Over the years, certain mistakes gained reputations of their own. The disappearing tithe was an entry in multiple towns where a donation would vanish and be blamed on a festival, too joyous to count soberly. The phantom donkey incident appeared across 3 counties, describing an animal that delivered goods then turned to mist. These repeated tales formed a kind of folklore among scribes. Apprentices would recite them not as cautionary tales, but as templates. They were told that imagination was part of the profession, and that truth was best presented with a flourish. In one memorable case, a royal steward was questioned over missing wine barrels. He replied that the barrels had developed souls and wandered off to preach sobriety. The court laughed, the king applauded, and the steward was promoted. Such moments cemented the value of creativity in clerical work. While warriors sharpened swords and priests recited liturgy, the accountants learned to gild error. They made faults into fables and missteps into mysteries. The best among them could mask confusion in calm language so serene it lulled suspicion to sleep. The tradition endured not out of deceit, but necessity. The world was uncertain and the margins narrow. A truly honest account might damn the innocent or enrage the powerful. The art of blame allowed room for mercy. It softened the edges of scrutiny. It preserved dignity where precision might destroy it. And in doing so, it kept the books not only balanced, but bearable. One scribe wrote near the end of his ledger, "Have blamed the stars, the rain, the cats, and the saints, and in doing so, I kept the peace." Today, few remember the names of these accounting poets. Their excuses have faded and their metaphors grown obscure. But if you find an old record that speaks of time drifting or sums that refuse to appear, know that you are reading more than error. You are witnessing a silent tradition of grace under Pressure, a profession that chose kindness over correctness. And perhaps even in our modern world there remains a place for such gentleness, a soft way of saying I tried, and that is enough. There was a time in the late 14th century when a single illustration nearly caused the unraveling of a duchy's financial strategy. It was not a map nor a decree, but a chart simple in form, hand-drawn, in soft brown ink across a sheet of linen-backed parchment. This unassuming graph appeared in the annual accounting scroll of Count Bertram of Esmere, and it came to be known by a peculiar name embroidered later on tapestry, the climb and the fall. At first glance it showed what many graphs show, a line ascending gently across time, before dipping slightly, then rising again. But then quite suddenly, without explanation, it plummeted in a steep drop ending near the bottom of the page in a dramatic swoop. The line represented expenditures across a 5-year period, but what alarmed everyone was the final section. It resembled the angle of a cliff and appeared to suggest that the county's treasury had fallen off an economic precipice. Advisors gasped, clerks exchanged worried glances, and one steward reportedly fainted. No one questioned the numbers as much as they questioned the image. How could expenses soar then collapse without war, plague, or theft? None had been recorded. Whispers of corruption fluttered through the hallways like winter wind. The man responsible for the graph was a well-meaning scribe named Aldrich, who had only recently been promoted from tallying sheep ties to managing royal visual summaries. He had never drawn a graph before. The idea to include a line chart had come from a traveling Florentine merchant who had spoken of visual persuasion. Aldrich, eager to impress, had decided to graph the data rather than list it. Unfortunately, his spacing was inconsistent. The steep drop did not reflect catastrophe, but rather the end of available parchment. He simply ran out of room. When summoned by the Count, Aldrich trembled with scrolls in hand. He explained that the line did not imply ruin, merely that he had underestimated the scale. The figures were stable, but the line had nowhere to go but down. The Count stared in silence for several minutes before waving the young man away. No punishment was issued, but the damage had been done. The image had already spread. Merchants feared a downturn. Neighbors paused trade agreements, and rival lords began preparing for what they assumed was an impending collapse. In the weeks that followed, the erroneous graph took on a life of its own. A traveling minstrel turned it into song, describing a silver line that rose with hope then fell like pride. The lyrics were mournful and catchy. Farmers hummed it in the fields. A weaver in Norm even embroidered the line onto a banner beneath, which she stitched in profit we fall. Ironically, demand for the graph soared. People wanted to see it with their own eyes. The Count's treasury grew briefly from curious visitors and donations from sympathizers who believed they were aiding a failing province. Academics too were drawn to the graph. Scholars at the University of Dunwich wrote treatises debating whether the descent was a metaphor placed deliberately. Some claimed it reflected a philosophical stance on fortune's wheel. One professor argued that the graph mirrored the rise and fall of empires and should be read as cautionary art rather than financial data. Another published a volume entitled Curves of Collapse, featuring the graph on its cover. Aldrich, meanwhile, watched in confusion as his mistake became monument. Eventually, the graph was reproduced as stained glass in a chapel devoted to Saint Simplicity. The final downward arc was placed just above the entrance, casting a red shadow across those who entered. Pilgrims began tracing it with reverence, some believing it predicted personal setbacks, others convinced it was a holy shape of humility. The graph had become myth. It was no longer about accounting, but about the inevitability of descent after descent, the reminder that what goes up must at some point come down. Despite the confusion, the original ledger remained archived in Esmere's hall. Future scribes were instructed never to graph without sufficient space and to always clarify axis meanings. Aldrich, however, became something of a folk hero. Though he never again drew another graph, he was requested to speak at gatherings of scribes, and was gifted a silver ruler engraved with the words "Mind the margin." He lived the rest of his life peacefully, remembered not for his miscalculation, but for the conversation it started. In the broader realm of finance, the graph inspired changes. Accountants became more cautious in visual representation. A school in Westerbridge introduced a new subject, the art of gentle illustration, where students practiced depicting economic shifts with curves so soft they looked like hills. The term graphing with grace entered the vocabulary of scribes. The mistake that had once triggered panic now guided gentler truths. Curiously, the economic health of Esmere did dip slightly in the following year, not from actual loss, but from cautious spending based on the perception of decline. The county's people became more frugal, hesitant to invest or celebrate. The graph had shaped behavior. A line once drawn in error had bent reality. And so it was that numbers could not only record but also direct history. The pen in Aldrich's hand had unknowingly moved 1,000 others. Years later, as the story faded, a tapestry was discovered in a retired merchant's loft. It showed the famous curve rendered in green thread with silver beads at each turning point. At the base where the line dropped near the bottom, the weaver had stitched in tiny script, "Here began wisdom." And perhaps that was true. For all the confusion and unintended consequences, the graph taught a lesson not just in caution, but in how a simple image could echo across thought, memory, and myth. In quiet corners of accounting halls and Scrabble schools, the tale of the falling graph was still told, not with scorn, but with gentle amusement. It became a reminder to all that in their ledgers and diagrams there lay a subtle power. Not the kind that conquered or commanded, but the kind that persuaded, shifted, and shaped how others would think and feel. A single stroke once misdrawn became a legend, not because it was perfect, but because it was believed. And so if ever you see a line that climbs and then suddenly dips, consider not only the data, but the hands, the minds, and the margins behind it. For in that descent there may lie not disaster, but a moment of pause, of reflection, and of understanding, shaped not by numbers alone, but by their silent storytellers. In the stillness of ledgers and the hush of quill strokes across parchment, there lived a phrase that emerged not from proclamations or sermons, but from the sighs of tired clerks and the weary blink of overworked accountants. The phrase was not born in celebration or cleverness, but in that familiar moment when the day grows long and truth becomes less absolute than necessary. "Fine, just write it down," they would say, not with triumph, but with surrender. It did not mean they believed the numbers were right, only that they could not afford to remain unfinished. It was the anthem of those who understood that the pursuit of perfect records could devour the day and leave nothing but ash where a report should have stood. It began in the minor offices of small manors and outposts scattered across the countryside, where a traveling inspector might arrive to reconcile grain reports only to discover 3 different sets of numbers for the same field. One claimed the harvest was abundant, another claimed it was fair, the third claimed no harvest had occurred at all. The steward would scratch his beard, the scribe would wipe sweat from his ink-stained brow, and after moments of tense silence someone would speak those now familiar words. They would dip the quill into tired ink, and the number would be recorded, not because it was proven, but because it was time to move on. The phrase was not a mark of deceit, but rather of practicality. It admitted what few would say aloud, that the perfect record is an illusion, and the pursuit of flawless accounting in a world of rain-soaked receipts and miscounted goats could stretch until eternity. Monks in cold scriptoria whispered the phrase over tax scrolls that had been smudged by candle wax. Castle treasurers muttered it when decimal marks vanished from ink bleeds. It was not an act of fraud, but one of mercy upon their own minds. 2. Finish a page was an act of courage as much as precision. In time, the phrase made its way up the bureaucratic ladder, from the hay-scented barns of village recorders to the heavy oak tables of royal financial chambers. Kings did not speak it, but their ministers did, and when asked to explain why an entire barony's income had been rounded to the nearest 20 coins, the treasurer would simply tilt his head and say that sacred line, "Fine, let's write it down." It became both shield and salve, a balm for the anxious and a closure for the exhausted. Even bishops, who audited cathedral donations, learned to say it with a shrug. At the Academy of Applied Tallies, a respected instructor named Brother Felwyn once attempted to ban the phrase outright from student practice. He spoke of discipline, accuracy, and divine arithmetic, But one rainy afternoon, when a confused novice presented him with 5 conflicting goat tallies and no surviving witness, Brother Felwyn looked up from the scroll, sighed deeply, and whispered the forbidden words. His students nodded in understanding. Theory bowed before the relentless hunger of unfinished parchment. It began appearing in margins as abbreviation, a quiet FJWID scrawled next to dubious entries. When ledger books were copied, the phrase sometimes survived, even without its original context. Some thought it was a blessing, others thought it a warning. Traveling scribes swapped stories of moments when a single line could not be proven yet had to be written. It was said that a ledger left blank invited suspicion, but a ledger completed, however imperfect, invited sleep. Ballads began to circle around the phrase, not sung in grand halls, but hummed near storage barns and inns where clerks gathered after tax season. One such tune called The Last Entry told of a scribe who spent 3 nights trying to count barrels of salted fish lost at sea before giving up and whispering, "Fine, let us write it down." The sea had taken the fish, but the ledger had to hold something. The song ended not with glory, but with a yawn and the gentle snuffing of a candle. In one peculiar case, a small duchy near the northern marshes adopted the phrase as an unofficial motto. Their seal bore no lion or dragon, but an open book with an ink pot resting calmly nearby. Their scribes were known for calm decisions in chaotic times. When asked why their financial reports rarely included footnotes or revisions, they explained that they trusted the scribes' wisdom and their willingness to stop arguing with uncertainty. "We believe in the wisdom of closure," said one clerk, "and in the mercy of finished lines." Even artists embraced the phrase. A painter once depicted a scribe with furrowed brow bent over a parchment where numbers danced like leaves in wind. Behind him stood a cloaked figure with a gentle hand on his shoulder, not an angel or spirit, but the embodiment of the phrase itself. Her presence was calming, not commanding. The painting was called The Piece of the Final Line and hung in the hallway of a regional tax court, where it was said disputes dissolved faster beneath her gaze. In later centuries, the phrase became a proverb, applied beyond accounting. Farmers used it when estimating seed piles, neighbors used it when recalling debts, and herbalists used it when noting down the weight of elusive roots. The phrase left the page and entered the rhythm of speech, a kind of linguistic shrug, a permission to proceed despite doubt. It was never about laziness, but about allowing life to continue. For if every record waited for full proof, nothing would ever be known. Even today, the spirit of that phrase lingers. In spreadsheets, cells left blank too long, in rounding errors forgiven, in balance sheets submitted at the final hour. We may no longer dip quills or stretch parchment, but the quiet compromise still lives within us. "Fine, let us write it down" is not defeat, it is continuity. It is the acknowledgement that truth may hide, but life must move. It is the small breath at the end of calculation, the hush that permits tomorrow to arrive. So if ever you sit with numbers that do not quite fit, with memories that blur, or facts that flee, may you hear the echo of a tired voice, centuries old, offering not solution but solace. Finish the page, close the book, light the lamp for rest. For sometimes the greatest wisdom is not in knowing everything, but in knowing when to let the ink dry. In the final age of parchment and quiet ink, before ledgers gave way to memory and memory to silence, there sat an old accountant whose hands no longer trembled and whose eyes still caught even the softest mistake in the margin. His name was known once, but faded with time like a chalk mark left under rain. He held no rank of nobility, no badge of honor, but his position was firm and singular. He was the last, not the best or the most famous, only the final man tasked with writing down what remained. His office stood at the far edge of the Royal Archive, a narrow chamber with dust-soft walls and a small window that faced the rising sun. Morning light would stretch gently across his desk, illuminating the stillness. There were shelves, but they stood nearly bare. The books that once lived there had been reviewed, archived, and forgotten. The only item left of note was one final ledger, bound in soft leather corners, untouched, uncreased. Its pages were crisp, waiting not impatiently, but curiously, as if wondering what would be written, if anything at all. For years he had done what all before him had done. He recorded sheep and barley, brick and butter, labor and loss. When wars passed through, he noted what they took and what they left. When plagues visited, he wrote the names of those who vanished and the few who remained. But then there came a year that offered no event. No taxes were raised, no bridges collapsed, no kings died, and no festivals demanded funding. He waited, but the world outside remained still. And in that stillness he paused. He arrived each morning, opened the book, and held his quill. He stared at the page as light moved slowly across the wood grain of his desk. But he did not write, not out of confusion, but out of choice. He turned pages carefully, each one blank, until he reached the middle, where he would stop, close the book, and begin again the next day. This pattern continued not for days or weeks, but for 3 seasons and a part of a 4th. To those who asked, he only nodded gently and said there was nothing yet to note. Eventually someone noticed. A curious clerk from a neighboring ministry asked why the official records had not been updated. She arrived at his door with polite concern, but when she saw the calm in his room and the quiet presence of the empty book, she asked no further. She stood for a moment, then left without a report. Word spread slowly, and some began to speculate. Was it a silent protest, a sign of fatigue, or a subtle wisdom beyond their understanding? No answer came, but his silence deepened. One morning the clerk returned and sat beside him. She asked what he saw in the blank pages, and he replied softly without turning. He said he had written for so long about what had happened and what might happen that he forgot how to record nothing. He did not mean absence or emptiness. He meant peace. That rare interval when the world did not demand ink, when numbers could rest and not be summoned to prove or measure or explain. The blank pages, he said, were not failures. They were kindness. Some weeks later others began visiting. Not inspectors or auditors, but scribes from distant regions drawn by rumors of the man who did not write. They sat in quiet corners, watching him open the book, turn the page, and pause. Some brought their own parchment, intending to take notes, but few did. Most sat for a time, then left with the same silence they had entered. What they carried with them could not be copied or filed. It was the recognition that sometimes history needs no witness and silence is record enough. Seasons turned. Again and still he wrote nothing. One morning he did not arrive. The window remained closed and the chair undisturbed. Hours passed before a clerk opened the door. On the desk lay the ledger untouched, beside it a small folded note. It read only one line. I saw all that was not written, and it was good. They searched the pages, but found no secrets, no hidden script, no final entry to decode. Only light stains of fingerprints and a single feather caught between the pages like a bookmark left by the wind. The council debated what to do. Should they fill the book with estimates or leave it as it was? After some days they voted to bind it without additions and seal it among the royal records. On the spine was written simply, "The Quiet Year," and though no numbers marked its pages, it became one of the most borrowed ledgers in the archive. Students, scholars, even monarchs would ask to see it, to open its cover and feel the weight of nothing held in place. It was not emptiness, they said, but rest. Years passed, and still the empty ledger traveled. Once it was placed in a cathedral beside a book of prayers. Another time it was exhibited beside a war diary to show contrast. Eventually it returned to its shelf, not because its meaning faded, but because silence does not beg to be repeated. It waits, it listens, and then it settles. The desk where the accountant once sat remains in the archive, its surface worn smooth by time and touch. A small plaque reads, "The Final Accountant." No dates. No title. To this day some say a distant cousin of that man still works in a quiet room, deep within the modern records office. He too is said to write less than expected and pause longer than most. Some believe he understands something we do not, that history is not always carried forward by what is said or tallied, but by what we allow to remain unsaid. There is space in the world not just for records, but for reflection. For the courage not to write when the moment asks for peace instead, and so when you find yourself rushing to explain or mark, or remember, take a moment and think of the man who sat with an open book and chose instead to close it. Not out of fear or laziness, but out of deep respect for the quiet, for the in-between, for the season when nothing happened and that was worth everything. Beneath the grand banners of battles and the soaring arches of cathedrals, beyond the songs sung for kings and the oaths sworn by knights, there were always rooms that held no audience and no applause. These were not places of spectacle or celebration, but of quiet repetition and tireless focus. These were the chambers of account, where quiet hands moved steadily across parchment, where numbers breathed softly and truth was carefully estimated and logged. The scratching of quills was their only fanfare, the slow drying of ink their only victory. And though the world remembers kings and conquerors, it forgets that the ledgers kept beneath those triumphs were what kept the kingdoms standing still. It is tempting to believe that history is made only by the bold and the brave, by the ones who raised swords or banners, who delivered great speeches or rode into glorious battles. But history is also shaped by the measured, by the recorded, by the balanced. Not every legacy is carved into stone. Some are penciled into margins. Some are counted not in battles won, but in errors avoided, in bridges built within budget, and in granaries that never went empty. And in those ledgers time found its rhythm, quiet yet constant, steady as breath in a sleeping body. Imagine a world without them, without the people who tallied the grain, who noted each coin, who knew when a tax had been paid and when it had not. Imagine a world where kings ruled lands they could not count, where armies were funded with numbers guessed and forgotten, where fields were left fallow because no one had recorded the harvest from the year before. The world would not unravel in fire or famine, but in vagueness and uncertainty. Because chaos does not always begin with a crash. Sometimes it begins with confusion, and confusion is what creeps in when nothing is written down, when the past fades into obscurity and the present loses its anchor. The accountants of the Middle Ages were not guardians of power, but guardians of continuity. They did not ride at the front of armies nor sit on thrones, but they made sure those armies were fed and those thrones did not fall from financial carelessness. They were the ones who cut civilization as it stumbled and helped it stand again with a careful note and a second glance at the numbers. Their names were rarely carved in stone, their portraits seldom painted. Yet they preserved the framework upon which kingdoms rose and often quietly kept them from falling. When roads were built, when granaries were emptied, when bridges needed repair, it was they who asked how much, who paid, and when. The ink they spilled was not for glory, but for gravity. Each line they drew anchored a fact, each fact a consequence, and each consequence a future decision. They were the hidden mechanics of governance, invisible until their absence brought the weight of collapse. In their silence, they carried the burden of decision-making for generations, working in the shadows with a clarity that many in the light could never achieve. In every scroll they kept, in every sum they balanced, lived a conversation between the past and the possible. They did not write poetry, but they told stories with columns, margins, and abbreviations. A missing number was not merely an oversight. It was a question, it was tension, it was a signal. A sudden surplus in a district's account could hint at generosity or embezzlement. A consistent rounding error might speak of laziness or quiet protest. They were interpreters of signs written not in stars, but in silver, wool, salt, and ink. Their daisies never lifted to the heavens, but remained fixed on inventories. And in those inventories they found omens and order both, and still they were not machines. They were not unfeeling servants of math. They made choices every day. Sometimes they rounded with mercy. Sometimes they added with a heavy heart. Sometimes they guessed when the numbers just would not come. Within those guesses lived tired compassion or quiet fear. Some ledgers still bear the tremble of aging hands, the smudge of ink where fingers lingered too long. In margins one can find jokes, scribbled notes, drawings of cats and spirals, and sometimes poetry never meant to be read. These were not sterile records. They were deeply human artifacts, telling not only of economies, but of emotions, not only of taxes, but of time. One dusty book recounts a clerk who recorded the same toll each day for 20 years, because nothing ever changed on that lonely bridge. Another ledger includes only the phrase, "I tried," written again and again on different days in different hands, perhaps by different people. One page contains no name, but the drawing of a sleeping cat curved perfectly between the columns. These are the echoes of patient labor of nights spent in candlelight of hands that worked not for recognition, but because the work needed doing. It was their way of saying I was here, and I cared. We tend to honor those who shift the course of history, with bold acts, with loud moments and shining victories. But the world is also preserved by those who keep things steady, by those who ensure that bread costs the same today as it did yesterday, that taxes are counted and workers are paid before the first stone is laid. Without them the grand gestures collapse, without them the music stops and the lights go out. The accountants of the Middle Ages were like the threads in a vast tapestry, unseen but essential. Remove them and the images unravel. Perhaps that is why their legacy is so curious. It is not built in monuments, but in margins. Not in glory, but in guidelines. Not in fame, but in footnotes. Yet what we have discovered in this slow and steady journey through their lives is that theirs is the story of order in a world of chaos, of structure in a world prone to collapse. They did not strive for greatness, yet they created the quiet conditions that allowed greatness to flourish. They were the pause before the policy, the caution before the command, the quiet reckoning before the roar. Even now, long after the quills have been set down and the parchment sealed, their impact lingers. It lingers in the budgets we balance, the forms we fill, the receipts we fold and tuck away, the digital apps we open as tax season approaches. All of it is built atop systems that began with candlelight and wax seals, with pages sewn together and stored in locked wooden chests. And within those systems live whispers of people who never wanted to be remembered, but who left behind memory nonetheless. So let us thank them. The quiet stewards who asked where the coin had gone and what remained. Let us honor those who knew that a misplaced mark could crumble an estate and that a blank page might erase a year. Let us remember that history needs its singers, yes, but it also needs its scribes. Those who dared to count in a world that preferred stories. Those who wrote not to inspire, but to account. Those who believed that to write something down was to take responsibility for what came next. So let us take a moment to thank them. Not just the heroes or the visionaries, but the quiet stewards who asked where did the coin go and what is owed. Let us honor the ones who knew that a misplaced mark could topple an estate and a missing page could erase a year. Let us remember that history needs its singers, but it also needs its scribes. Those who wrote not to inspire, but to account. Those who dared to count in a world that often preferred myths. They did not compose anthems, but they composed balance sheets, and in that quiet arithmetic lived a dignity that endures. For in the end, it may be that history survives, not because it is remembered perfectly, but because someone tried to write it down at all, tried to bring order to a scattered world, and even in failure left behind something honest. A ledger, a page, a name scratched into wax, a small gesture against forgetting, a quiet gift to the future, a final entry in the great book of what it meant to be human. As we come to the end of this long and gentle journey through the ledgers and lamplight of the Middle Ages, let us sit for a moment in stillness. You have wandered through the flicker of candlelit rooms, through the rustle of parchment, through the strange humor and small triumphs of those who work not to be seen, but to keep everything seen in order. You have met the ones who counted what others overlooked, who preserved the world one column at a time. And though their names are mostly gone, their imprint remains like quiet footprints in dry earth. History so often sings of glory, of conquests and crowns, but beneath those songs there are murmurs. The murmurs of ink drying, the turning of pages, the sigh of someone erasing and rewriting a total just to be sure. These small sounds do not fill ballads, yet they filled centuries. The ones who wrote them knew they might be forgotten, and yet they wrote anyway. There is comfort in that thought, that even when no one was watching, someone still tried to make sense of the world. Perhaps in our own lives we to become like them. quiet stewards of our little domains, balancing time and effort choices and consequence, doing the best we can with the figures we have. And maybe that is enough. To be thoughtful. To pause before the next line. To record what matters, even if it is only for ourselves. Because someday someone may read it and find in it not just data, but a human voice whispering across time, I was here. I tried. So now, with your eyes growing heavy, and the sounds of history fading like the last lines of an old song, let the ledgers close. Let the ink dry. Let the numbers rest in silence. You have been kind to listen to the forgotten ones, to walk alongside their patient hours. May you carry a little of their stillness with you into your own quiet night. May your thoughts settle like parchment in the dark. May you dream not of battles, but of balance.